Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Erskine Bowles, co-chair, along with my pal Hank Paulson of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group, and we're delighted you all could join us this morning. The theme of today's event is the same as the title of a book that many of you have in front of you today, Maintaining the Strength of American Capitalism. From my vantage point, the theme couldn't be more timely or more controversial. I believe the future of the American form of capitalism is one of the most important questions facing our country today. There are two assumptions that we have that underline this theme in our book. The first is that American capitalism should not be abandoned, and the second is that our current economic policies must be adapted, modified, reformed, so that our center system works for more people, a lot more people. This is why we are here today, to think together about the specific reforms that would strengthen our system of capitalism and allow more American workers and families to more fully benefit from it. You know, I've spent the best part of the last 10 years on American college campuses, so I'm rarely surprised by anything anymore. But I must admit, a recent Gallup poll worried me quite a bit. I know most of you have seen it. It showed fewer than half of young Americans are even positive about capitalism, while some 51% have positive attitudes about socialism. For an old capitalist like me, that's pretty worrisome, and it conveys the urgency of the questions that we are going to discuss this morning. It also is a reminder that we better not take for granted the institutions and systems that have propelled centuries of economic prosperity. Now, what I personally, and this is just me, worry about the most is the sustainability of a system that yields such large economic disparities. It strikes me as unjust and, yes, immoral that in an era of such prosperity, 500,000 people in this country experience homelessness on any given night, and 1 in 6 kids, children, experience food insecurity. I am also deeply troubled by the fact that the American dream appears to be dead for millions and millions of American kids who are born today into low and middle income families. I can't count the number of parents who told me when I was at the university or traveling to other universities that they could live with the fact that their own lives may not be better than those of their parents, but they couldn't live with the fact that their kids' lives may not be better than theirs, that their kids may not get a real shot at the American dream. It just seemed to them and to me that the lucky gene pool is too big a factor in outcomes today. Lastly, I am concerned that ensuring that our markets are the most competitive in the world and whether our competition policies are keeping up with market dynamics. So I believe it behooves us to take a hard look at the outcomes that our system of capitalism is producing and see what can be done to improve these outcomes for more people. And again, I want to stress for a lot more people. To this end, we have decided to focus today's events around 3 topics. First, we'll hear about the causes and consequences, pros and cons, costs and benefits of recent trends in market concentration across many American industries. Second, we'll have a discussion about the strategic investments we should be making to promote economic fairness, mobility, and opportunity, and we will discuss the fiscal constraints that bind these policies. In this regard, we will discuss new ideas that relate to tax reform, entitlement reform, increased revenue and spending, and weigh these ideas against other alternative approaches. And we will close with a fireside chat with Ray Dalio and Hank Paulson about the evolution of American capitalism. Finally, before I turn the podium over to Hank, I'd like to reemphasize that today's event coincides with the release of a book you have in front of you. Our group is putting out this book to advance evidence-based policy proposals that are part of today's debate. I should stress that the book features different and sometimes opposing viewpoints, not all of which represent my own views or those of Hank or the other members of the Economic Strategy Group. We are proud of this book and the rigorous fact-based policy analysis that it features by leading experts, some of which are with us this morning. We invite you to take a copy of the book with you today and distribute as many as you want to others that you know. I should also add that the opinions you will hear discussed today by our panelists are those of the speakers themselves and not in all cases those of the members of our group. However, our group always tries to bring together experts we can learn from and debate with, experts from across disciplines, experiences, and political lines, and in today's case, speakers who offer a unique and diverse perspective on how we can make capitalism work for more people. And now, without further ado, let me turn the podium over to my good friend and co-chair, Hank Paulson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erskine, and thank you all for joining us here this morning. As Erskine said, we chose today's theme because many of the features of our nation's capitalist economy are being criticized with renewed vigor, and the basic assumptions that underpin our system are being called into question. Some say that our system is rigged for the elite, that free markets and free trade offer a bad deal for most Americans. Others argue that our system can't adequately deal with problems like climate change and rising inequality. Even a proud capitalist like me worries about the dynamism of a system that appears to be increasingly concentrated and the effects this is having on wages, competition, and consumer choice. I believe reforms are necessary and our economic model needs to be adjusted. And, all of the members of our Aspen Economic Strategy Group have agreed that more people need to participate in our economic success. So the debate over how to strengthen and update American capitalism is healthy and essential. But we need to do a better job of defining the problem and clarifying the facts. Today, we have a great lineup of speakers and I want to thank all of our speakers for being here today. Thank them for their time and for their contributions. Thank you to Thomas Pipillon, Nancy Rose, Chris Hughes, Damon Jones, and Jim Tankersley for lending us their expertise today. And thank you to the following members of the Economic Strategy Group who will be joining today's panels: Melissa Kearney, Doug Holtz-Eakin, Greg Ip, Bob Rubin, and Ray Dalio. Finally, I want to thank all of the members of the Economic Strategy Group who are here with us today, as well as those who couldn't make it, for their contributions and for their work. Now, please join me in welcoming our first panel today. Thank you.
I guess it's okay. I'll sit down over here, I guess. Thanks. Jason Furman couldn't make it, and Doug Holtz-Eakin will be taking his place on the panel. He should be here in a few minutes. We're just going to get started now. The topic is causes, consequences, and responses to market concentration. We have a couple of excellent panelists. Nancy Rose is one of the country's leading economic experts on antitrust issues. She was chief economist for antitrust at the Department of Justice in the end of the Obama presidency. She's now head of the economics department at MIT. We're very fortunate to have her here. Thomas Philippon teaches at New York University. He has just written a book which is getting very well received in such modest publications as the Wall Street Journal. It's called The Great Reversal, and it's a fascinating study looking at trends in market concentration in the United States versus other countries. Just to sort of set the stage a little bit, I think that the last time America went through a period of soul-searching about the nature of capitalism was probably at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, with the growth of the very big corporate trusts that gave rise to the passage and then the vigorous enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and culminating in 1911 with the breakup of Standard Oil. We've come to call this the progressive era. And I kind of feel like we might be on the cusp of another sort of progressive era, because we're going through many of the similar economic trends and questions about corporate bigness. We have, by a number of indicators, higher concentration. We have the rise of these technology companies that are very dominant, much in the way that Standard Oil was in its day. We have a wave of huge mergers. In fact, next week in a courtroom in New York City, there is going to be a lawsuit challenging the merger of T-Mobile and Sprint. A merger which, if it goes through, would reduce the United States from 4 national carriers to 3. So it's very much in the headlines, and so I think the timing is perfect to try and have a vigorous discussion about this. Thomas, I want to start with you, and I want to ask you first, if you could lay out for the audience today the broad landscape of the state of market concentration in the United States today. What are the facts that we can all sort of agree on, and how it's evolved, and whether we in fact are more concentrated today in the United States, and how that compares to other countries?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So I'm just going to lay out a few facts for the discussion. The way we measure concentration is we look at an industry and we look at the market share of the leading firms, the top 4, the top 8. So if you look at these metrics, over the past 20 years, the average market share of the top 8 firms has gone up by about 8 percentage points. So typically an industry would have 35% would be the market share of the top 4, 8, and then that went up by about 8 points to say something like a bit more than 40%. That's true in services and in manufacturing. So that's the broad landscape. It's not true in every single industry, but it's true in the vast majority of industries. If you look at other regions, so I spend a lot of time looking at Europe. So Europe, the data is not as good as in the US, but the range of estimates is from a small decrease in concentration, either or it's flat or it's a small increase, but it's nowhere near the increase we see in the US. So I think that's kind of the first thing, that's the first fact. Now, the thing that's very important as soon as we talk about concentration is to understand that concentration in and of itself doesn't mean that something bad is happening, because you could have concentration roughly for 2 types of reasons. It could be that the leading firms are just getting better and better over time, and they're expanding, okay, and that's efficient. So it's possible, in fact, it's often the case that it's efficient to have very large firms in an industry. In that case, you wouldn't want to prevent these efficiency gains by preventing firms from being large. So there is lots of evidence around the world throughout history of large firms being efficient and having large market shares. So that's the efficient type of concentration. The inefficient type of concentration is when firms, either via lobbying to get the regulations they like, or by playing very aggressive games with potential entrants, rig the system to prevent entry and competition. Now that would also lead to concentration, but that would be a bad type of concentration. So then the game, if you want, for people like me who do research, is to tease out, do we have the more good type concentration or more of the bad type concentration? And I think the bulk of the evidence suggests that we've moved from dynamics that were more consistent with good type concentration in the 1990s to, in the 2000s, in recent years, dynamics that look more like the bad type concentration. So just to give you one example, good concentration should come together with fast productivity growth and lower prices. To give you one example, this is exactly what happened when Walmart expanded from the mid-80s to the late 90s. Okay? That came together with very fast productivity growth in the retail sector. Profits of Walmart were actually flat over time, the profit margins, and prices were going down. So when you see that as an economist, you're like, okay, that looks pretty good. On the other hand, if you see concentration and very high prices, like the prime example would be in the telecom industry in the US today, then you're very worried.
Nancy, what do you think? Do you agree broadly with that, and how would you expand on that? And secondly, how would you assess the state of antitrust policy and enforcement today? I mean, is it up to the task of dealing with some of the trends that Thomas described?
So let me take each of those separately because I think they're quite different. To some extent, this debate over concentration and what the facts are resonated very much for me in a recent Economist article about inequality, which the premise of which was we think we all know how much worse inequality has become, but the underlying facts may not be as they appear. And I think there's some of that going on in this concentration debate. There are a set of broad facts that I think that we could agree on. Maybe the most basic one of which is large firms in the economy within broad sectors seem to have grown. If we take the statistics that Thomas just shared with you, the top 8 firms now have about an 8% higher combined market share in many of these broad sectors. What do I mean by that? Something like food manufacturing, which would include everything from pet food to artisanal chocolates to bakeries to chicken processing to ethanol production, right? So a very broad sector. The largest firms each have expanded on average their market share by about 1 percentage point. I think when you frame it in that context, it makes you step back and say, is that alarming? Should that be alarming? If the top 8 firms have a combined market share of 40%, it tells us that on average there are 20 firms competing for businesses. So if these were true markets, I think that most economists who study industrial organization and competition would say it doesn't look to us like there's much room for alarm. If we had 20 different firms competing for our business as consumers, I think we would feel that we had a lot of choice. The problem is that these aggregate statistics don't tell us much about what's going on underneath that. And I think just as when you go to the doctor with a fever and the doctor is thinking about prescribing Tylenol, an advanced antibiotic, or doing an emergency appendectomy, you'd like the doctor to know more about what's causing that fever before she chooses one of those options. And I think that's a bit of what's going on in this debate.
So where would you come down on it? Are you worried or not worried about the degree of market concentration?
So honestly, I think that there are particular markets where there are good reasons to be concerned.
Such as?
I would say healthcare, where there's been an increase in concentration. Maybe that ties in with some of the antitrust enforcement questions. It's interesting, Thomas, when you raise telecom, and Greg had mentioned this trial next week to block the merger of Sprint T-Mobile to preserve 4 national competitors. What he didn't mention is that the plaintiff in that trial is not the United States government, the Department of Justice, which saw fit to issue a complaint that said it would be a disaster for competition if we reduced the number of national mobile carriers from 4 to 3. So it said going from 4 to 3 would be bad for competition, and then created this incredibly bizarre patchwork of what they call a remedy to try to allow the merger and then replace that competition with a kind of Rube Goldberg device involving Dish and services that Dish would buy from the new Sprint. I think but France is my understanding, which you provide as an example of a place where there hasn't not only are not high prices, but has been a lot of competition. Also has only 4 national facilities-based carriers.
Yeah,
right?
We went from 3 to 4.
Right. So they've got 4, but haven't seen, according to some of the statistics that Thomas provides, the same level of competition. He argues France has had much more competition in that space. I think that goes not to competition policy, but to a different set of regulatory issues that the United States considered and rejected. So I think it's a complex set of factors. The one thing I would say from my time at DOJ is I think that antitrust enforcement has been increasingly hobbled, both by the way the case law has evolved and by the way the agencies approach some of the particularly conduct concerns, behavior concerns, but also some of the mergers.
Doug, what do you think? Do we have a market concentration problem? And if so, what should we do about it?
I don't think we have a generic one, but I would echo some of the things that Nancy just said, particularly hospital service areas. We have some places in the United States that are highly monopolistic, particularly rural areas. And people talk a lot about U.S. health spending, and they always bewail the price of prescription drugs. But if you want to figure out the spending, it's the doctors and the hospitals. And there's a real absence of competition in some of those places.
So let's turn to the policy side. You said that you think antitrust has been hobbled. What do you mean by that? And give me the report card on this administration's antitrust efforts, and what, if anything, would you do differently?
So broadly, I think there's been a 40-year trend toward laxer enforcement, and that's taken place. I'll take that in two categories. One is mergers. In the 1960s, through the 1960s and 70s, relatively small mergers would have been challenged, or were in some cases challenged. You had to do that ex post. Over time, we've raised the concentration threshold before the agencies tend to get alarmed. And so if we used to enforce, roughly speaking, mergers that would take 8 firms to 7 or 7 firms to 6, now we're more likely to enforce 4 to 3, or maybe not even until you get 3 to 2. And that, I think, is reflecting in part a misreading of the economic evidence on what the effect of merger-induced concentration is. It's even worse on the conduct side. So we talk about monopolization, the discussion about the tech sector and what kind of behavior firms are engaging in that sector, and could we bring antitrust cases? Let's just say, not even before we get to the Warren proposals to break up tech, which would be, if not impossible, extraordinarily difficult under current antitrust law. But just behavioral cases have become much more difficult for the agencies or for private parties to successfully bring. So predatory pricing standards have become all but unenforceable. Exclusionary behavior and monopolization behavior has become very difficult to successfully litigate a challenge. And I think that's what we need to change.
So you brought up big tech, and let me sort of expand on that point, because I think one of the few things on which, for example, Republicans and Democrats agree on in Congress is that we have a problem with big tech companies being too large. Are there things, Doug, I'll start with you, are there things specific to the nature of companies like an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google that make them more formidable as potential or actual monopolists? And if so, what's the solution?
So I guess I'd say a couple of things. First, since I'm imitating Jason Furman, I'll just point out that he chaired this commission in Great Britain that looked at this issue, and they came to the conclusion there's nothing inherent about this that leads to monopolies. There are scale advantages, certainly scope advantages. They're unique in some ways, but their recommendations did not go to the point where you say, well, we have to regulate them as public utilities because it's inevitable that they are going to be monopolies. I think it's important to remember, and we've seen other situations where, Microsoft being the leading example, where we sort of thought, oh my God, they have this inherent advantage, and it turned out not to be true, right? So I think history and some people who looked at it carefully would say, no, these are not definitely monopolies. There are, some areas in which people like Google are in fact dominant. So let's look at search. But that's not all Google does, and that's the interesting aspect of those platforms is that you get this sort of demand complementarities because people are searching. You can give ads to them because the ad's working. That people go there to search, and that's the unique feature then that allows them to get such scale. And I think that's something that's worth looking at pretty closely. For aficionados of theory, Robert Lucas wrote a paper on this in 1978. And said that the firms are going to get bigger because of the unique, scarce thing is entrepreneurial talent or things like the insights that Google had. And when you get that, you can combine it with a lot of capital and labor and get a big return on it. That's exactly what we've seen.
So when you take a company like a Google, which has like a 92% market share in search, or Facebook, which is like some similar share of social media, it's difficult for at least a consumer to feel like they really have a choice, right? Now, Google will say, oh, you're all one click away from another search engine, but as a practical matter, people don't click away. And that, in fact, because Google has become such a good search engine, the algorithm learns. The more people use it, the better the algorithm gets. The better the algorithm gets, the more people use it. And so this sort of like, I think, leaves policymakers in a bit of a dilemma. And Tom, I'd like you to actually address this because the Europeans and the Americans have taken a very different approach to how to deal with this, right? The Americans, with the case of when the Federal Trade Commission looked at accusations that Google was driving people towards their own advertising or their own platforms for people who were like searching for restaurants or stores. The Federal Trade Commission said, yes, they are preferencing their own sites, but that maybe that's anti-competitive, but it's also helping consumers, so no harm. But the Europeans took a very different approach on that. Yeah, and tell us where you come down on this. What's better for consumers, the European approach or the American approach?
Well, on the specific issue of tech, we need both. But I think it's very important to take a little bit of a step back here. Like, what Europe is doing today is pretty much what the US was doing in the 1990s, and it's not by chance. It's because at the time we set up the single market in Europe, we looked around, and 20 years ago, it was obvious to everybody that the one place on earth where you would learn about free market was the US. So the reason the European playbook is the way it is because it is more than influenced by the US circa 1990. And it goes way beyond just pure antitrust. Like, my favorite example is still the telecom industry. And I think one number should be in your mind. Like, all of you in the room, if you lived in London, Paris, or Berlin, your cell phone bill would be half, and your internet bill at home would be half as well. I don't mean 10%, I mean literally 50% less. Right? The average household in the US pays $68 per month to get broadband access. The average household in France pays 31. The average household in France has 5 providers to get broadband internet. The average household in the US has 1.5. Okay? And that's all because of regulations to try to encourage entry. And in the cell phone carrier, we had 3 pure oligopoly, very high prices, and they lobbied very hard to prevent entry, brought a 4th one. That is, we forced them to have a 4th one that would be a new competitor. That's exactly what the US used to do. This idea is a very American idea. And then this competition brought prices down by 50% in 2 years. Okay, so that's what the Europeans have been doing. They've been doing it successfully in, I would call them plain vanilla industries, such as telecom, airlines, transport, energy, by the way, same thing. If you buy your gas or electricity in Europe, you have many providers to choose from. So all of these markets that are plain vanilla, we made them more competitive by essentially adopting the US playbook. Now we come to tech, which is a lot more complicated because it is more global and it's like the tools are not exactly adequate. And as Nancy was saying, there is stuff that Europe anyway couldn't do. Like, even if we wanted to break up Facebook, that's never going to happen in Europe because there is no reason to do it in Europe. There is no case for that. So the best you can look at for Europe is what works, what doesn't work. In the tech area, I mean, the plus side, you could say, where we try to protect data. So when California started doing its own version of data protection, they looked at the GDPR from Europe. That's good. It's still a very messy process, and it's not nearly optimal. So there is a lot to improve there, but we tried at least. And then the other thing we tried is to do something about market dominance, broadly speaking. But what we've learned is fines and this kind of process is very slow. So every time we went after market dominance by, say, Google, we ended up with a significant fine, but by the time this happened, the competitors were dead already. So if you want to learn from the European experience for the tech, right, then you learn that you need to be much quicker and a bit more creative in what you do. That would be my takeaway.
Nancy, what do you think? What should we do be doing, if anything, about tech company dominance?
So maybe I could take this in 2 parts. So first, I think that the competition policy enforcement regimes are less different, with one major exception, between the US and the EU than Thomas thinks. In terms of merger policy, I think the 2 jurisdictions are broadly very similar. Modulus, maybe I hold off the current administration, which seems quite at odds with even past Republican administrations. In behavioral and conduct cases like the Google case that Thomas mentioned, European law deviates from US law in a very significant way, which is that it has a clause that prevents what it calls abuse of a dominant position. That's not part of the longstanding U.S. antitrust canon. And so in the U.S., antitrust enforcers can't go after a company that's large in its market just because it doesn't like because it's charging high price or it's undertaking certain types of actions that would be fine if the company were smaller, but that we don't like if the company's big. And I think that's part of where, when there's been a divergence between what the European Commission is doing in competition against, particularly in the tech sector, most of that is coming through this channel we don't have available to us. I actually think that, as I just said, I think the competition policy is not that dissimilar. I think the difference in many of the examples that Tomas given really do come back to regulation. Yeah. And there, as he said, and as Doug has mentioned, I think it's quite fraught. I mean, when you think about regulating tech, it's an extraordinarily innovative sector. One thing that we know from a long history of regulation in the US is that regulatory apparatuses tend not to be particularly friendly or able to accommodate to rapidly evolving innovative sectors and often discourage innovation. And so I think we want to be quite careful that we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater if we think we need to move to regulation. I take GDPR as an example. So this is the data protection regulations. That improves consumer privacy protection, and I think it's outrageous that the US doesn't have anything to protect consumer privacy. On the other hand, if you're thinking about competition in this space, there's some recent work that suggests that those privacy regulations have made it more difficult for smaller firms to succeed or for firms to come into the market. So you're better on privacy, but you're maybe worse on competition. And that tension can recur across a whole set of regulatory decision making. So, and I'll move back to the investment incentives in a regulated environment as well. So I think one of the big reasons for the contrast between the US and some of the examples in telecom of prices in Europe is because a number of European countries, I think, have established regulations that require companies that own the wires to sell access to their wires at very low prices to virtual competitors. So that's what a lot of these virtual mobile network operators, mobile telephone companies are. If you set that price very low, it's a wholesale price for being able to, set up the Rose mobile telephone service and charge $15 a month to you because I can buy it from Tomas Wired Company at $10 a month. You're going to have low prices for consumers, but you might discourage investment in the facilities that provide that access. And I was intrigued a couple weeks ago when, in an entirely different context, a panel on China, somebody said, well, try getting a 4G wireless signal in Paris, and I thought, or in France, and I thought, what does he mean by that? So I know the examples of of mobile plan prices being much lower, but when I went to a site that tries to determine what fraction of the time a user has access to a 4G signal, it turns out in the United States, that's 90% of the time that you're on your network, you can get 4G. In the US, in France, that number's 68%. And that maybe, I don't know enough about the industry in France, but maybe that's reflecting this kind of differential investment in quality. And so we have to be a little bit careful when we just compare prices, that there's not some hidden quality differential.
Doug?
So a couple of things. I was going to make the point about the compliance costs of the GDPR, which are really quite high. Some firms would argue you literally can't comply with it, but it is a barrier to entry, and I do think we need to worry about that. On the privacy front, one of the things that I forecast, I have lots of incorrect forecasts, this is one of my most recent, is that there was no question there would be privacy legislation in the US this year. It was something both sides agreed needed to get done. A preemption at the federal level for lots of state initiatives seems to make some sense. And it hasn't happened because it turns out to be incredibly complicated. And here's a flavor of it. One of the things that Jason's commission suggested is essentially allowing data mobility. So you have a package which is your data and you get to take it from Google and go give it to someone else or take it from Facebook. And this would be a way to engender entry and competition. So the question then becomes, what is data? And if you sort of think about your interaction with Google, for example, there's basically some offered data. I have a name, birth dates, all that stuff. You offer that up and identify yourself. There's a bunch of observed data, which is your interactions with the sites. What kind of searches did you do, things like that. And then there's some inferential data. What have they learned about you and the way you will react to certain incentives? Which data is mine? In fact, a lot of the data that's important is actually created during the interaction with the site and is a joint product. And what these privacy legislation really is about is assigning property rights to the data. And you can do that wrong and actually really blunt investment incentives and stop the innovation. And I think this is going to be tough to get right. I think it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, but that's exactly my point, which is we know these things are messy. And therefore, the only way to do it is you try, and then you try to fix it. And I think there is no way that the Europeans are going to get it right by themselves. But you can also learn from what they've tried. And I agree with you. Like by far the biggest issue with GDPR is it creates barrier to entry, because the compliance costs are high enough that actually it's a boost to Google and Facebook because they have the means. So that's clear. That's the main downside. And the upside is that it has lots of ramification outside tech, by the way. One of the biggest implications of GDPR is it made the banking system much more competitive. Because now that you have the principle you own your data, you can share your data, which is all your credit history, with whoever you want, including a bunch of fintech, which is now why we have open banking working very well in the UK and France and various countries where fees are going down for basic banking services. So that's also thanks to
GDPR, is it?
It's GDPR together with the
No, the UK's got an incredibly complex regulatory system in the fintech space.
But the big change was GDPR together with the Payment System Directive. Because together, that meant that we could tell the banks they have to create an API so you can share your data. You can push your data to like a fintech provider to aggregate your account and give you advice about asset management.
Right, but
that was a big change. But that was the principle behind it, the motivation for doing that was the fact that you own your data, not your bank. That's just an example of like one side effect. So I think that's the point, which is this thing is so complicated and messy that it's going to have a ramification and costs, and you just need to learn what's the best way to do it. And I think that neither the US nor Europe alone could do it correctly. And I think if you learn from each other, there's a chance you're going to have something that works.
Well, before we go on, we're agreeing more than anything else, because the great policy fight of 2001, 2, 3 was network unbundling for the telecoms, and we decided it was a bad idea. It was exactly what it was hurting investment incentives.
I want to just interject here. You all have a question card, by the way, at your seat. So we're going to move to Q&A in about 10 minutes. So if you have a question, please write it down on that, and we will have staffers coming around picking them up, and they'll bring it up to the front. I want to stick with the tech question for a moment, Thomas. Now, to what extent? So somebody who was skeptical of breaking up big companies would say that there are many supposed monopolists who've ended up not being so monopolistic. So we used to think Yahoo had monopoly in search, but then it crumbled because Google came along with a better one. We used to think MySpace would have all these network effects in social media until Facebook came along and turned out to be a lot better. Microsoft used to have a monopoly in desktop operating systems and application software, and now nobody thinks that they're nearly as formidable as they used to be. Does this history suggest that we can rely on market forces to bring down these monopolistic or market-dominant companies?
Yeah, so that's the big question. Can you trust that the market itself is going to self-correct? I think the history is mixed. I think what is always true is that all of the monopolies, even you started talking about Standard Oil. If you look at the history of Standard Oil, it was an amazingly innovative company. They pushed productivity. Like the reason they became Standard Oil is because they innovated a lot, actually. It was not just some fat monopolies that did nothing. They got there by being super innovative. Now, at some point, they become very large, and then what do you do? By the way, I think the same thing happened with Walmart. Look at the growth of Walmart. They got to the point, early 2000, we're like, wow, they are so dominant in retail. That's a big issue. If Amazon didn't show up, maybe we would be discussing, should we break up Walmart? Now, Amazon showed up. So I think it's mostly random. And you can't just make a prediction that's going to be universally true. Sometimes you're going to have a competitor like Amazon showed up right at the right time to compete with Walmart. And so now you have this duopoly, which I think looks pretty competitive to me. So I'm not too worried, to be honest. And some other cases, it doesn't happen. If you look at the data, so to me, there are two statistics that I find worrisome that speak to this issue. The first one is, concentration itself, it's kind of, like the thing you can put in the headline because it's easy, but it's not, as Nancy explained, it's not like the right number to think carefully about these issues. One I like a bit better is turnover, so you can look at, try to define finely grained industries if you can, and then just figure out if the same firms are dominant over many years. Okay, because it's one thing that you have concentration today, but if it's not the same leader 5 years later, maybe it's fine. And this number has creeped up. So like today, the chance that if a firm is dominant today, it's still going to be the same firm dominant 10 years later, that's higher than it used to be. So that's one. The other one that I find worrisome is in the past, if you looked at where is a lot of money being made across industries, and you rank industries by the one with the highest profits towards the lowest profits, and you look at entry rates of new firms 5 years after, or over the following 5 years, then you would have a very strong correlation. You would have much more entry by new firms in industry that have very high profit rates, which sort of makes sense. But now, if you look at that fact over time, it used to be very true in the 70s and 80s, and since 2000, that correlation has been close to zero. That suggests that for whatever reason, it's not happening. Like you don't have this fundamental rebalancing of entry in very high profit margin sectors. So I think that's the thing that as of now, maybe something could be done, which is not going to happen automatically in the market.
In fact, a factoid I remember from Jason's report was that Facebook and Google both emerged from this kind of like, free-for-all where there were like literally dozens of search companies and dozens of social media companies, none of which stayed dominant for more than a few years. But Google and Facebook have both maintained their position now for almost a decade.
Yeah.
So we seem to have moved well past that point. And also, I know a lot of people say, well, look, Microsoft isn't dominant any longer, but then people would say that's because the Department of Justice spent 10 years suing them. They ultimately settled the case, but Bill Gates might have been tempted to go and crush, Yahoo or Google or some other company without the fear of a vigorous antitrust behind them.
Can I wait? So I think your observation that often these companies that we think of as inviolable, they're going to be in this position forever. If we look back through history, we do discover a lot of examples. AOL, for those of you who are old enough to remember, right? It was the internet, right? And now nothing. I think what's important for that, and it is, there are strong forces toward that, and as Thomas mentioned, they're not necessarily inevitable, but it often occurs. But I do think having a strong competition policy, as you just mentioned, provides the framework that allows that to happen more readily. So I think in the tech sector, we have these large platform companies that we're concerned about. I think there are very strong network effects in those. And so the competition is less about, as economists say, competition in the market, who's going to get a little bit bigger. It's more now competition for the market. Are we going to have a replacement of one firm with another? And I think for that to work, for the conditions to be ripe for that, first we need those large dominant firms not to be able to buy nascent competitors, potential competitors, threats that are just emerging on the horizon and could become the next, say, Facebook. And if we allow Facebook to buy those firms, then we miss out because they've now brought them inside and they're no longer a potential competitor. And I fear that some of that is going on in the tech space. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking that's saying, oh yeah, Facebook WhatsApp or Facebook Instagram or Google Waze, those are all examples of that. Hard to be completely confident, but I think we can say, particularly because, as I mentioned, courts have evolved to make it much more difficult to enforce some of the kind of antitrust law that we used to enforce. Potential competition is an example of that. The US judiciary is extraordinarily skeptical of potential competition merger cases. And so now it's almost impossible, maybe even impossible, to successfully block an existing firm from buying up a very small potential competitor that doesn't really have much market share. So that's the kind of thing where I think reinvigorating antitrust policy could make a big difference.
Thanks. By the way, we'll go to questions very soon. So if you have a question, if you've written it down, hold your card up and somebody will come and collect it from you. I want to move a little bit beyond the traditional antitrust issues and market concentration issues, which are about us as consumers, and talk about us as citizens, because there's another piece of this monopoly debate that's going on right now, which is that these tech companies aren't just potentially monopolizing our economic life, but they're monopolizing our democratic life, that they have become platforms of expression, and it is their decisions and their gatekeeping roles that determine who gets to express themselves. This, as you probably know, is one of the big sources of complaints of conservatives who believe that they are inordinately shut down because their opinions are not popular with the people who run these companies. I'll just discuss quickly an example that I wrote about, which was bail bond companies, for example, are very unpopular. They do something that a lot of us don't find very nice. They charge, by and large, very poor people who are in trouble with the law large sums of money so they don't have to wait in jail while they're awaiting their trial. And a lot of people feel cash bond is very bad. And so Google agreed and banned all bail bond companies from its platform, which is a problem because bail bond companies no longer have a way to advertise. They used to advertise in the Yellow Pages, but the Yellow Pages have been driven out of business by Google search. Now, like or don't like bail bond, it's legal. It serves some kind of a purpose. Is it right that one company, whether it's Google or Facebook, should allow its particular political or social values to determine who gets to advertise or who gets to speak? Does anybody want to address that first?
Oh, no, I'm not going first on that one. Are you kidding me?
How about you, Doug?
No, I don't think it's right. And we tried to give them a way to ignore whatever business interest they had in keeping certain things off the site. Right? That's something maybe their customers don't like seeing bail bonds ads, and so they have a business reason not to put it up there. By giving them this carve out in liability for opinions expressed on the site, not making the site liable, is a really important part of the architecture of how the social media world's developed in the United States. But I don't think it's worked out as the way it was intended, and that's something worth revisiting.
Nancy, this actually goes by the name of neo-Brandeisian, I think, antitrust theory, or hipster antitrust, some people say it, which is that antitrust shouldn't just focus on the traditional economic metrics like consumer welfare, but go beyond that. And it's the role of antitrust to tackle bigness in and of itself. What do you think? Is that a useful way of thinking about the role of policy?
I think not, for two reasons. I think first, there's been a set of proposals to expand the antitrust laws to be not about competition, but about kind of public interest. So any merger would not be judged by a standard of whether it reduces competition, but whether it's in the public interest. And behavior would be judged this way. And as you said, there's a very strong kind of anti-big theme running through it. And I think that creates a lot more danger for us than is maybe immediately apparent. So first I would point to the telecom space where the Department of Justice and the Federal Communications Commission share merger review responsibility. Either one could block a telecom merger. The DOJ operates under a competition standard, and the Federal Communication Commission operates under a public interest standard. And what you have going on in many telecom mergers is interest groups coming to the FCC and saying, we'll drop our opposition to this potentially anti-competitive merger if we get some benefits from it. So could you tell the companies they can have their merger if they have to spend X billion dollars on building out rural broadband, on putting facilities in my state, if it's a state that's going to it. It's sometimes been described as an opportunity to come with your holiday shopping list and present it to the FCC. And I think that's, Tamaz written about kind of regulatory capture and the consequences of that. I think that's a terrible recipe to introduce into the entire economy, which is what antitrust goes to.
I think that the neo-Brandeisian, perhaps you can, I mean, it's not very fair because none of us is really a believer in this, so I don't think we're giving you a fully representative sample of what's out there. But I think the argument would be that when firms have too much power, they just have too much power, period, and you got to do something about it. And now the question is whether you want to do it via antitrust or something else. And I think what we're all saying is doing it via antitrust sounds really like the third or fifth best, which is if nothing else, perhaps, but otherwise it's not the first thing you would do. But you have to consider that the alternatives are also very likely to happen, because if you look at the data, for instance, in some of my research, I tried to figure out why don't we see more entry of new firms or growth of new firms. And a good predictor of not seeing entry of new firms is past lobbying by incumbents and campaign finance contributions by incumbents. So now so then to be fair, if you could fix that problem by changing the lobbying, by making the regulators more independent from the lobbies, but that means giving them more money and more independence and less revolving door. And good luck doing that with the FCC. And then the other thing you could do is change campaign finance law. How likely is that to happen in the US today? I think it's zero, right? So then this more logical alternative, if you're worried about business excessive influence, this more sensible alternative to going after that, maybe they are not really on the table. I think that's why the neo-Brandesians are just putting all their cards on antitrust. I still believe it's a bad idea, but I think that's the logic.
But I'm not sure, and I totally agree with what you're saying. I'm not sure that the argument that says it would be really tough to get effective campaign finance reform, which I personally think is a tremendous contributor to this. So therefore, but it's easier to get fundamental antitrust reform that goes to a you just can't be big standard. I don't think that's any easier. No. So I think we should tackle the underlying problem rather than the symptom.
I agree with you.
Okay, we'll go to some questions now.
She was my professor, by the way, so it's biased.
That's right. Yeah. Well, you've passed your dissertation, right? So you don't have to worry about what are the consequences of concentration for labor markets, i.e. monopsony? Is it possible that lack of competition is leading to sort of inferior outcomes for workers, reduced wages in some markets or states, or even suppliers? Thoughts?
Yeah. So there's... You want to go for...
So there's a concentration literature in labor markets, which finds high correlations between employer concentration and lower wages. It's hard to infer causality there. So is this because in labor markets that have experienced an increase in employer concentration, it's because a large employer is shut down, so there's less labor demand, and that's reduced wages. It's also increased concentration. I think it's a little tough to know how much monopsony is contributing to that problem. But I do think there is an increased awareness by both the DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission that there has not been enough attention to the effect of mergers upstream, so either on labor, hiring labor and wages in labor markets, or on upstream suppliers. What's happening if insurance companies get to merge, and that's suppressing the prices that they're paying to healthcare providers. That's sort of an anti-competitive harm, just as hospitals merging and increasing the prices they charge downstream is an anti-competitive harm. So I think there's a recognition that we need to do more, and that the antitrust law is symmetric in that it is not only possible, but there have been successful cases that have been brought alleging this kind of upstream harm. Not so much in labor, that's relatively new, but there have been some particularly say in the healthcare setting where employers have used their market power to reduce nurses' wages in an anti-competitive fashion, and the DOJ has successfully brought challenges to that. So I think it's an important recognition that we need not just to be looking at prices that consumers pay downstream, but what prices are paid upstream as well.
In the labor market, there is some evidence that you have like no poaching agreements and non-compete agreements are more frequent than they used to be, and that mechanically they lower wages. I think what we don't know is whether that's a 0.5% story or a 1% story or a 2% story. My sense of looking at dividends, it's there, but I don't think it's a very, very large number for the aggregate economy.
I'll bring up one example that neither of you did, which is one of the arguments about Amazon's problem is that, for example, they're now the dominant third-party platform for selling. Now, 15 years ago, if you were a small seller of like linens, you know, in a small town, and you wanted a national presence, you would open an online store. Now you know that most people go to Amazon first to search for linens, and they will never come to your personal online store. And so in some sense, you're sort of, Amazon exercises monopsonist power over those suppliers, and it doesn't show itself, it manifests itself as high prices to me as consumers, but as reduced profit margins and reduced income to the suppliers. Is that a legitimate concern? Is that something we should be looking at?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm not sure
what are you
I'm not sure you can get to it through antitrust.
No?
Right.
But doesn't that show that one of the problems with our antitrust system?
So again, if the reason that everyone goes to Amazon is because that's offering a service to consumers that's incredibly valuable, and so Amazon is then able to attract third-party sellers to its platform, we tend to think that if you've gained your market power or your market share by outcompeting alternatives, you're better than eBay, say, which would be an alternative way, that you're entitled to the fruits of your labor in that respect. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm just saying I don't think that antitrust has got a solution to that unless Amazon is doing something a step beyond that. So if it's engaging in kind of exclusionary behavior that makes it more difficult for those third-party marketplaces sellers to compete, you know, that's potentially actionable. But
Actually, that
That
actually
would
takes
be a
it.
difference, by the way, I think, where
yes,
what
it's
Nancy was
yes,
saying
because
That's when
of
the law is
the
different.
dominance.
That's
between
right.
the EU
where it
and the
matters.
US, that's where that's an example where it would be different. In the US, it would be very hard to just go after Amazon just for that. In the EU, you could, and in fact, people are thinking about it right now. The burden of the proof, if you want, is a bit lower. If you can show that they have this massive dominance in the market for a platform for attracting third-party sellers, then that's enough to do an inquiry.
Now,
If the standard's consumer welfare, you don't care what happens in the supply chain. You see what?
no. I will
Right? I
disagree
mean-
with that. So we say the standard's consumer welfare. Think of it as trading party welfare. I think the standard's no, in the sense that what Amazon is selling to the linen store is access to consumers. They're charging a commission for that.
Yeah.
And if they did something, if they engaged in anti-competitive behavior to be able to increase commissions,
If they did.
yeah. But I'm just saying it's not that consumers don't pay anymore that is the issue, because you could go after them for the commission increase.
Oh, if they did that, yes. Okay.
Right. Now, I think part of the way, by the way, that platforms like Amazon might reinforce their market position, and this is something that while in the U.S. there have been very few cases in this space, I think there could be more, is if Amazon's contract says you have to charge the same price for your linens on the Amazon platform as you do in your online store.
These MFN clauses.
Right,
Yeah.
right, most favored nations.
Yeah.
Then I think it would be challenging, given the legal environment. The courts are, as I said, pretty hostile to conduct cases. But I think there's a case to be made there.
This actually takes us very nicely to the next question, which is one of the neo-Brandeisian charges against Amazon is they're driving all their competitors out right now via predatory pricing, by underpricing them. And Wall Street is letting them by supplying them with all this capital to finance their losses, because they're looking ahead to that point 10 years from now when they've driven everybody out of business and can raise their prices. What do you think of that? What is the state of predatory pricing in this country, and what, if anything, should we do about it?
So there are two different questions, and I will just go back to Thomas' example of Walmart and Amazon to say those are exactly the arguments that were made against Walmart. In some places still are, right? They come into a small, especially rural town, like the small town in Pennsylvania that my mom lives in, and they lower prices, and the existing bricks and mortar stores can't compete, and they leave. And that's competition. But it was alleged, well, it's predation, because as soon as they get everybody else out, then they'll raise prices. Well, they haven't done that. And we've seen entry by Amazon into that space. So I think we have to be really cautious before we say, well, prices are going down, and so less efficient competitors can't survive. Therefore, it's anti-competitive. I mean, that is the competitive process. And I guess I worry about it, but I haven't seen the kind of analysis that would say, oh, it's clearly anti-competitive. they're not selling below cost as best
I think
I can tell.
it's a bit like the wage story. We have a few examples where they did it. The famous one is with the diapers.com story. But if you look at the big picture, it's not happening on a large scale. So the question is, when do you think it's become really a problem? I mean, they've clearly done it in a few cases. The question is, is it widespread enough that it's that you want to do something about it?
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. What do the panelists think of Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren's plans to unwind mergers, many mergers? Doug, start with you.
Her plans are all tied for last, in my view. So,
Why?
I think that she has made the case on big, like they're big. Anything big, I'm going to unwind, and that's not a compelling case. And that's not the standard we should have.
Wasn't she right about the banks?
She was not right about the banks. In what way was she right about the banks?
We had these big banks, and we had a crisis as a result.
We didn't have a crisis because we had big banks. We had big banks involved in a crisis, and we had inadequate capital and a whole bunch of other prudential regulatory problems, but it had nothing to do with them being big. You need big banks. If you're going to have globally competitive firms, you're going to have banks that can provide them with the scale and the scope of those services. You cannot run a modern economy on little banks.
Either Thomas, Nancy?
Well, the question is how big is big, but I mean, I don't think you have a massive problem of size of banks today. Because by the way, they haven't grown since 2010. So I don't think that's not first order on my list of issues. I think, to be fair to, I think what Elizabeth Warren was trying to do is, I think there is what you want to achieve and then the way to get there. And if to get half of the way through, you have to say, I'm going to try to break them up, then maybe that's the way to start, knowing full well that, by the way, that's the same thing with Microsoft. Like, officially, the idea was to force them to split in, and that never happened. But you could still, well, that was still useful because it forced them to scale down some of their ambitions, left some room from some of the other guys, and that's why we have Google. Maybe Apple came back also thanks to that. So, so then it's, do you interpret the statement as literally, I want to do that, and that's the only thing I care about? Or is it, I'm giving you a direction, and then I know we're not going to go all the way to the end point. I think my main worry, to be honest, is more like, I think when people start lumping Amazon, Google, and Facebook in the same basket, I'm like, I don't think that makes any sense. They are very different businesses. And if you look at what they do, what they produce, what they bring to the economy, they are not the same. So you want to, I'd be careful in putting them in the same basket.
We're out of time, but it's been a really good discussion. Thank you very much, Doug, Thomas, and Nancy.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's good they don't run.
Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. The program will start in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I go to maybe like 3 programs a year. Oh, yeah. I come to like three. I mean, if I'm from here, but I come to like maybe 3 a year. But I feel like it's, it's a good organization to support, and I just love the fact that I can talk to them. Is this something to turn on too? Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. The program will begin shortly.
That's why I miss in Richmond. Because we lived here for 10 years. But I don't miss the life of DC. I don't miss the traffic in crazy. Yeah. But I do miss this. The ability to like tune into events like this and towns. I'm like, when I lived here, we was like a car, and for a while on the nights when I had a car, and we would drive, and it made it very livable. But now that I come to visit, it's just Williamsburg is so easy. Oh my gosh, we go and that's this one place called Williamsburg Inn. And we just go and like, I pay $5 and we just park, never have to worry about anything.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
It's nice. Easy living. Weird to
If Greg does it, I should do it.
I was gonna say those don't look like they can get you very far.
thanks so much for joining us.
I'm very excited for this discussion. My name is Jim Tankersley. I'm your host, and I've got a very fun panel here, starting from Damon Jones, Chris Hughes, Melissa Carney, Bob Rubin. Your program will tell you who they are if you don't know, but you should know. And we're going to jump right into this discussion of capitalism and economics and the path forward. And so I want to start with Bob. This is I would call it not a Rubenesque policy moment that we're in right now in either political party, both the party in office that is throwing up tariffs around the world and a large part to the Democratic candidates that wants to challenge the president. And I'm curious how you read that moment. What should the guide stars be of economic policy making right now?
Well, I might, it's interesting. It's not, my view would be basically this, Jim. I think there are principles in economic policy that, in a broad conceptual level, probably remain pretty much intact over time. Now, the application of them, the circumstances, the policies we should have to deal with the moment, obviously, can change and should change very substantially. But I think, in most respects, we're on a pretty bad track right now. That's my view, at least. Let me touch on a few base parts of that. There is, as we all know, a lot of criticism of market-based economics, of capitalism. But if you look around the world in the post-World War II period, the only economies that have succeeded have been economies that have been, at least in principle, committed to market-based economics. Even India, with roughly 1990, and China, roughly 1978, only began growth once they committed to market-based economics. So I think that's the path we should be on. There's a lot of support, particularly amongst younger people, for what they call socialism. When you look at their definitions of it, you get a little sense that maybe it's not so clear what they have in mind. I remember one prominent socialist was on television and was asked, "You mean like Venezuela and Cuba?" And she said, "No, I mean like the UK and Sweden." Well, they do not have a state-owned means of production. Anyway, be that as it may. But having said that, there are a vast number of very important issues that markets by their nature are not going to deal with. They won't deal with climate change. They won't deal with inequality. They won't deal with healthcare costs and healthcare coverage or immigration. And so there's just a vast number of issues. But it seems to me, Jim, what we should be doing is supporting market-based economics, but at the same time, supporting strong and effective government. And I think too often in the worlds that I've lived in, and have been around this for a fair while now, the people who care about growth and care about our market-based economic system don't support the effective and constructive and strong government that I think we need to deal with the issues that we have to deal with if we're going to have the combination, as Erskine said this morning, of strong growth combined with reduced inequality and strong wage growth.
I want to drill down. Thank you for that. I want to drill down with Melissa on the inequality question. This is something obviously you've written and thought about a lot, but you've also been quite critical of some approaches to combating inequality. And I was curious if you could sort of talk us through how inequality fits into policymaking now and the right or wrong way, in your view, to go about combating it.
Yep, thank you. So I do think inequality in the U.S. is a problem, not because I have a visceral antipathy to a lot of money at the top, but because I think that the persistent high level of inequality has really eroded economic opportunity in a sort of widespread way. It's eroded a belief in the American dream, and we need to do much more to sort of restore the promise of upward mobility and economic opportunity. You're right that I'm very skeptical of some of the more radical proposals to respond to income inequality, like a universal basic income, for example, which is what my colleague Magna Magstead and I have written about in this book. I think that these calls for sort of really dramatic and radical responses like a UBI, Medicare for all, free college, I think it's really useful because it sheds light on the question of what should our spending priorities be, what should our social contract be, and though I reject the sort of radical appending of our system, I do think we need to be doing much more to support struggling Americans. And I think there should be two goals in thinking about addressing income inequality and some of these challenges, and those should guide our spending priorities. So the two goals that I would lay out are, one, we need much more investment in people, and this gets to the point of stimulating economic growth and economic productivity. And so we need to be spending on things that will return an investment, and people and human capital and skills are at the top of my list. And second, we need a robust, potentially a much more robust system of social insurance in this country. And what I mean by social insurance is having consumption and income assistance to people who, to use colloquial terms, are unlucky or through no fault of their own find themselves with great economic need. And so if those are my priorities, then it's perhaps not surprising that I reject something like a universal basic income, which gives income to everybody. It would be massively expensive. It would move funds away from the populations and people that are now targeted and given preferential treatment in our social safety net, like the elderly, the disabled, and families with children. And it would do nothing to address the underlying challenges of labor market and economic trends. So I would be much more in favor of programs that invested in people, that spent money on education, that targeted money towards those who are particularly needy, especially children. We don't do nearly enough in this country to protect children. And that bolstered our social safety net in a way that really targeted the people who are most likely in need.
Can I make just one comment?
Can we get through opening statements first, and then you can?
As soon as I make my comment. No, I agree with Melissa, but I do think there's a fundamental issue, which is how we're going to pay for all this stuff. And I think that we have the ability through raising revenues to do that without more deficit funding, which I think is a road to perdition.
I thank you for previewing a later part of the discussion. But Chris, I want to get back to this question of how to make an economy work for everybody. And I'm just curious, are you hearing aggressive enough ideas for that, or how do you think about it?
Well, I will definitely answer that question, but just to take a half step back, I think we're living in a moment where we're at the top of the business cycle. I mean, just this morning, more job numbers, unemployment's at a record low. And yet we see across the presidential debate on the right and the left, immense frustration with economic issues, and really a blurring of economic issues with political issues. What is going on? Why are people in America so agitated? And I think if you look at the policies from the past 40 years, it's pretty clear. Median wages, flat. Productivity, disappointing. Entrepreneurship rates, small business starts, near an all-time low. Wealth inequality, income inequality, incredibly problematic, near an all-time high. And not talked a lot about today, but we need to, the immense difference between the net worth of white households and Black and Latino households in this country. The racial wealth gap is getting worse, not getting better. So people are frustrated with the existing economic order. And we have talked for years about a little bit higher taxes, maybe a little social insurance here or there. And it's failed people. So the moment that we're in is, I think, an economic and political turning point. No matter who wins the presidential primary contest on the left, we have opened up new ideas into this space. And the kinds of things that I do think that we should be talking about are free college, guaranteed income, universal child care, and a wealth tax and debt financing as ways to finance these things. Each of these things matters in different ways. The organization I work on, we work on anti-monopoly policy and we work on a guaranteed income. We happen to also agree that a UBI is not a great idea if you're giving $1,000 a month to everyone, particularly when it's justified as a response to technical automation. Instead, our view is that there's no evidence that the robots are coming, and there's plenty of evidence that income inequality is extreme and needs to be fixed. And there's a lot of evidence on the right and the left that the EITC and other cash-based policies are extremely effective. So let's build from that consensus in the policy community and in politics. And the one last thing that I'll say on this is that I don't think that the conversation today should be about, well, are the ideas sufficiently big or are they small? I think the premium should be on being honest with ourselves that we have invested a market-based outlook with so many hopes to figure out exactly how we should organize our economy. And on the merits, as it's been implemented, it's failed. And so we're at a turning point moment. And the faster we recognize that and the faster we talk about what to do, the better off we'll be.
Damon, can we step back even one more step and just think about sort of how do you think about this in terms of capitalism and where sort of all these things come together?
Sure. So I think that I would echo a lot of things that people have already said on the panel. I would say from a big picture, when I was invited to be on the panel, one thing that struck me was a framing of strengthening American capitalism. And to me, I think that ties in with something that Chris was talking about. But more generally, when I think about policy and economic policy, I think the goal is to improve social welfare. And so I think the primacy of capitalism as the route to do that, or however you define that, in particular market-oriented policies, or the primacy of growth as the outcome, to me, are not necessarily synonymous with improving social welfare. And so I think that the types of policies that we've seen where a consensus has been built around, maybe because it's thought that it can yield political consensus, is that we should put growth first and then the redistribution will come after. And I think that people are within their right to question that promise that has been made, and over the last couple of decades, it hasn't necessarily delivered on that promise, and we've seen inequality grow in income, and even more so in wealth. And so I think that actually it's important to be intentional about troubling that model of policymaking where if you trust me on growth, I'll deliver with inclusive growth, and try to shake the table and push for inclusivity as a principle as well. And so that I think the other thing is that some of these policies that are being framed as being bold right now, to me, they don't necessarily strike me as bold, and it depends on how you define these policies. And so another thing that comes to mind is that with basic income, with Medicare for all, with free college for all, I think that the details about what these policies mean are very ambiguous right now. And so it allows you to use it as a straw man counterpoint to the policy that you want to have and to bash it, or it allows you to view it as a very extreme type of policy. But I think that there are ways to design these policies that are not necessarily controversial and that are in line with like economic fundamentals and simple things that we tend to think about in economic policy. So for example, with Medicare for all, if that means some sort of universal health care, to me, there's a lot of economic principles that would lead you to that conclusion, that we should have a universal type of health care provision from grounds of social insurance theory. With basic income, I think there's two parts of that, and Chris touched on this. There's a floor on your income, and then there's how you finance it. And so I think that it has become sort of a lightning rod because basic income has been separated from all other taxes. But when you think about it within the tax system, there's a floor that we may want to establish for people's income, and then there's a question about who pays for it. And when you define who pays for it, that defines who gets a check. And so I think we can separate those two and look at something like an income floor, and both from our economic fundamentals be led to that conclusion that that's a good policy. And so I don't find these things as bold depending on how you define those policies. But the last thing I want to say is that the bolder versions of these things, I think, bring us back to that idea of being intentional about inclusive policies and trying to counter the decades-long focus on market orientation with the promise of redistribution that hasn't been necessarily realized.
Yeah. Can we just sort of step back now as a panel and talk a little bit about what we mean by inclusive growth? Like what would that look like to all of you to have this sort of economy working in the way that you each have been laying out? Melissa, go ahead.
So yeah, I'll take that. So, I think there's widespread recognition at this point that a rising tide doesn't just lift all boats anymore. We've seen that for the past 40 years. That, before 1970, all households quintiles sort of saw their income go up in similar proportions. And since 1970, that's broken down, right? So the top has enjoyed tremendous growth and the bottom hasn't. So I do think that there is and there should be widespread recognition that growth isn't sufficient. I mean, I took Bob's point to be we can't just throw growth away as a guiding principle, and we need to design policies that don't undermine growth, but realize we need to do more to establish inclusive growth. And the way I see inclusive growth is making sure that everybody, or at least most people, can productively participate in and benefit from the modern economy. And that's why I have a very strong negative reaction to the idea of just, well, you said it too, this is a large motivation for people who propose things like UBI. The robots are coming, AI is coming, a lot of people just aren't going to be that useful anymore. So we'll have a small share of really productive, rich people, and then we'll just distribute cash to everybody else. That, in my mind, is not inclusive growth at all. Inclusive growth would look like, close to 90% of prime age able-bodied people are working again. Right? Our levels of employment among prime age men in particular are still down, even though we've had a wonderful persistent recovery. Getting more people into the labor force and getting them into the labor force with higher wages. So the best way to make sure that everyone has higher wages is to make sure that everyone has more skills. And I will keep coming back to that, but we need to be investing more in skills and skill development so more people can earn higher wages. That said, I recognize that a lot of the middle-skilled, high-paying jobs are no longer available, and in this uncomfortable transition, a lot of people who would have in previous generations been receiving decent wages are now working in lower paying service sector occupations. And so I do see the need for and the benefit to subsidizing wages, and that's the earned income tax credit that we have. So let me just say one particular point on that policy, because both Chris and Damon brought this up. An earned income tax credit, which everybody loves, is very different and in some sense an opposite concept from a universal basic income. So universal basic income, you give everybody some money. Now a more targeted version of it, which is less bold and more reasonable, is let's give $10,000 to, let's say, all adults making less than $30,000 and then phase it out, maybe at a 30% tax rate. Note that would still be $1.6 trillion, which is much more than the $1.1 trillion we spend currently in all transfer programs, including Social Security. So it's still very expensive, so I would still say it's bold. But there, what you're doing is giving money to people who aren't earning and taxing it away in a negative income tax way. The earned income tax credit that we currently have and seems to have popularity across the ideological spectrum doesn't give money to anyone with no earnings. And then subsidizes the wages of people who work. So that's very much let's subsidize work, let's incentivize people to work, let's make sure work pays. Those are very different models of how we want to think about supporting people, and I think it's a really important debate to have, but we need to be sort of very clear on who's benefiting and who are the beneficiaries and who's left out of the systems that sort of favor growth and subsidize work versus a system that gives more income support to people who are out of the workforce, whether or not we observe any barriers to work. So that's the big difference right now, right? That's why conservatives like UBI, because we move away from our current system of categorical benefits, right? Where we say, okay, you're disabled or you have children and you're low income, so we give you money. Conservatives want to do away with that, trying to identify who's deserving or not, and just say, okay, let's give everyone who seems to be low income more money. In my social welfare view, I think that's a mistake. I think we should be protecting the people who have observed barriers to work and increased need. But let's also recognize that that's a decision point and that reflects different values.
Bob and then Dimo.
I was going to say, Jim, I think you need to start this process differently. I think you need to start by figuring out what you think your fundamental principles are with respect to how an economy is going to function. And I at least think that not only think, if you look historically, the only systems that have worked in the post-World War II period have been market-based systems. China's a little bit complicated right now, but fundamentally, Deng in 1978 committed to market-based principles. Zhirongji followed through. Xi is now a little bit ambiguous, but But I think then at the same time, I said this before, I'm going to say it again, you have to recognize that there's a vast number of issues it's not dealing with. I agree with Damon. I think social welfare is a good way to frame all this. But I don't think you're going to achieve your social welfare purposes unless you have an economy that's growing robustly. And I think, I had an op-ed in the, I don't mean to advertise my own stuff, but I had an Washington Post op-ed somewhere in early 2016 in which I outlined what I thought was an inclusive growth policy agenda. And it combined fiscal responsibility, robust public investment. I didn't talk as much as I should have, but I should have. Substantially increases revenues are 16% of GDP right now. At the end of the Clinton administration, we were 20% of GDP, and we had excellent economic conditions. That gives you a lot of money to work with. And I think I think you start with sort of a framework. You decide what your framework is. I think trade liberalization should be part of it. We're facing immense change with technology and globalization. McKinsey states at a report a couple of years ago now, I guess, saying 30% of all workers may lose the jobs that they're, or 40% of all occupations may no longer exist. Chris knows much more than I do about this. I think we can be very successful in response to all this, but we have to have an effective government that then can deal with, we have to maintain a market-based economy, market-based economics, at the same time deal with all of these other issues that Damon and Chris rightly point out. I don't think, Chris, that we're going to have radical departures in economic policy, and if we have the kind of radical departures you're talking about, I don't think it's going to work. And I do think we need a fiscal framework. Everybody wants to spend money, and that's fine, but you have to make a judgment. What are the risks we are taking? And maybe it'll work. I was in a panel with Jason Furman recently, and Jason thinks you can go to, he postulated the possibility you go to a much higher percentage of GDP than we have now, and we'll see what happens. Well, I kind of think if you go to a much higher percentage of GDP than you have right now, it might work, but also very well might not work. And if it doesn't work, what do you do then? And I don't think you have to do it, because I think we have plenty of room to increase revenues that would both pay, and this is my final comment, both pay for what we want to do and gradually reduce our debt to GDP trajectory.
Damon and then Chris.
Yeah. I wanted to respond to what Melissa was talking about in terms of the labor market. I agree that one of the things that might be preferable is to have a robust labor market with quote unquote good jobs and high wages. And I think that there's another thing that we can look at where we need to maybe understand what's going on. So the model that Melissa lays out has to do with human capital and skills being the thing that is driving whether or not you have a good paying job and high wages. And as someone who spent years and years in school, I obviously can't say that I don't agree that that is a factor. But I think another thing that in economic policy that we either take for granted or that comes unspoken is that in markets, power matters as well, and asymmetries matter as well. So what also could be driving wages is the leverage that there is between the employers and the employees. And so if there was a time where we had growth and a growing middle class, and there was also a role, there was more unionization in certain sectors. And so I think that's another thing that is immediately put into the bucket as something that is not competitive or pro-competitive. And if competition and market orientation is a fundamental principle, then those things aren't given the consideration that they may deserve. But now that we're seeing, as was mentioned in the previous panel, evidence of monopsony potentially in labor markets, not just from concentration, but from frictions and other things, it's not necessarily clear what unionization will lead to in a market. Using our economic models, we can have a case where more leverage for workers can lead to higher wages and more employment in a case when there is monopsony power that's present. And so something like an income floor could actually give workers more leverage if it's not tied to work to bargain for higher wages. And so giving transfers to people who don't work could lead to people exiting the labor market, but it could also lead to higher wages because they have more leverage now. And so I think that there's also a role to think about why are wages stagnant, and is it because human capital is stagnant or productivity is stagnant, or is there some role for this bargaining between workers and employers and power asymmetries?
Well, Chris, when we were sitting watching that first panel, you were animated wanting to talk about power. So do you want to just pick up from there?
Sure. Trying to keep a running list of, I have 3 points to make before the power one, so let's see how fast I can go. The first one, I want to start by disagreeing with Bob, but then I'm going to agree with him. So
You'll be half right and half wrong.
Exactly.
I agree.
The first point I want to make is I think it's really important to set aside this false dichotomy between market solutions and communist ones or socialist ones or Xi's solutions. I think most everybody, whether you're in economics, the law, or anywhere else, knows that markets are always designed. They are always designed in one way or another. They're designed in ways that work for some and don't work for others. And this, I guess, picks up on the PowerPoint a little bit without my realizing it. We design markets right now to mean that my tax rate is lower than my cleaning lady's. I'm a member of the 1%, she is not.
Boy, mine isn't. How do you do that?
Magic. That's a problem. The tax rates on the top 1% or down are lower than they should be on ordinary income. That's a point I'm making, and even in the aggregate. So that's a market-based decision. We can debate whether those taxes should be higher or lower, but we're talking about designing markets. And that's, I think, the situation of this conversation today, and in general, the situation of the debate in the United States. No one's talking about state control of industries a la Venezuela. I think that's a caricature. The second thing is, and this is where Bob and I think, agree, is that this idea that growth and inequality, that there's some trade-off between growth and equality, that has been pernicious for a very long time. But much of economics as a field is now making the case that actually inequality holds back growth. And one of the key reasons that growth is consistently disappointing is because inequality has been such a problem. Heather Boushey, the head of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, has a book out this fall. If you haven't read it, you should. It's called Unbound: How Inequality Constricts Growth. And so when we talk about the policies that we need to create more economic opportunity, I think we need to realize that those policies should also create more growth in the long term. Third thing that I wanted to touch on was this question of guaranteed income. So you'll notice, first off, that I talk about a guaranteed income and not a UBI. What's the difference? A guaranteed income is the historic idea that was advocated by Martin Luther, by Dr. King, by economists, and by Richard Nixon, to create an income floor in the United States that is not money for nothing to everyone. That is instead saying, as part of the social compact, we believe that no American should live in poverty. And we know from the evidence that cash is a very effective way to deliver on that promise. That idea has many different ways to implement it. Anybody who tells you that there's one way of doing it is misleading you. Just three as examples. Alaska has a universal dividend of several $1,000s a year that goes to everyone. That's based on a sovereign wealth fund. They distribute the returns to each resident of the state. Another is the idea of a negative income tax, where you're boosting everyone through the tax code. Another is by EITC modernization, and then there are still others, like Social Security for all. We can, if you want, talk about like the positives and negatives of each one, but the point is that each one is, the policy decisions are important, but we can decide exactly how these policies should work and how expensive they should be and where they fit. The last thing that I'll say on the power question is that I think that what the transition moment that we're in today in economics as a field and also in the law is that we are no longer only able to talk about efficiency. I mean, you saw this in the panel this morning. Economic efficiency is a very important and cornerstone idea, but we also have to be talking about power. Now, it happened to be that most of the panelists this morning were skeptical of the neo-Brandeisian outlook and the power ingredient, but we talked about power this morning already, and we're talking about it now. And I think that harkens back to a view of political economy, which we had in the United States, not just in the 1890s and 1900s with Sherman and Clayton Act, but from 1945 through the mid-1970s, when growth was at its most robust, when tax rates were higher, and when the economy was much more fair. And so I hope that change in the conversation leads us back to similar kind of broad-based prosperity in the next few decades.
We're going to get to questions from you all in just a little bit, but go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned the word fair. So I think a lot of what we're hearing is a reaction to the fact that things seem unfair. But that's not really an economic argument. And this gets back to I think the issue of big on the earlier panel, where on the earlier panel there was a question of, okay, so these companies are big. Is that actually bad? And I think a lot of sort of the ideas that you were articulating and Heather Boucher's, the way she sort of articulates this is the fact that there's great wealth concentration, that there's inequality at the top, that's bad. And I actually don't see much evidence. I can see why it feels unfair. I don't think the evidence base is very strong for saying that itself is bad. And I actually think that's really important, because if the point of raising more revenue is to invest in people who are struggling, then we want to think about the most efficient way to do that. And I would argue that the most efficient way to do that is closing loopholes in the existing federal income tax code. There's no shortage of options for raising additional income through the tax code. And there's a very nice chapter in the book that we're releasing today by Batchelder and Kamen that offer a number of ways we could raise $4 trillion by making incremental changes to the existing income tax code. If instead you just think it's bad for whatever reason that there are hundreds of Americans with large wealth holdings, which again, even Emmanuel Saez and Zuckman, I don't see the evidence that that's actually bad. But if you think it's bad, then you just want to break it up and you want to move to something like a wealth tax. And so whether the goal of income tax reform is to raise revenue to make spending investments that we need to make, or if the goal of tax policy is actually to take away income from the top, that shapes which kind of tax reform and spending priorities you're going to favor.
You don't think any of the concentration reflects rent-seeking?
Yeah, no, but that's about like what's driving it, and so that gets to like, do we want to change the rules of the game, and in the role of institutions and norms and power, and I certainly think that some of it reflects that, but the issue is whether the fact of wealth concentration on the top is bad for economic growth or democratic functioning, and so it needs to be broken up for that, as opposed to changing the rules of the game to making it, the acquisition of it is in line with the way we think that the market should be working.
Yeah, Bob?
I just think of something. Marty Feldstein, not too long before he died, said to me that if he, a conservative Republican, who was willing to engage in compromise, got together with a liberal Democrat also willing to engage in compromise, and if you focused on, this was actually about a year before he died, focused on facts and analysis, and you did it with intellectual integrity, sure, you'd have differences, but you could come together and agree on a set of policies to go forward that would basically deliver what we want, which is the interdependent objectives of growth and broad-based economic well-being combined with reduced inequality. And that I always thought was sort of the purpose of this whole Aspen Institute strategy group on economics. So I don't know, Jim, I think somehow or other, if this group is going to accomplish anything, it's got to find some way of supporting effective government, because without strong and effective government, we're not going to get where we need to get. And I believe deeply in market-based economics, but I don't think it's going to work unless we have strong government. We're not going to preserve capitalism unless we have strong government to do all the things we were talking about here. And then somehow or other, if possible at least, find some agreement on broad principles of economic policy, recognizing we'll have different views as to where that should go, and even some differences on those principles. But Marty said, and I think he's probably right, that you could, even on the principles, you could reach a large measure of agreement as long as it was thoughtfully worked through.
But there does seem to be a fundamental disagreement between not just Democrats and Republicans, but different experts along the spectrum on this question that Melissa raises of whether concentration at the top is in of itself bad and needs to, and would it be, as Democrats have started to argue in some of the primary campaigns, pro-growth, simply to break it up no matter what you do with the money. Chris, I'm wondering what you think of that.
I think there's a pretty broad consensus amongst both political leaders and Americans that concentration of wealth and power in the United States is at an extreme and unacceptable level. I mean, Trump campaigns on that, Biden campaigns on that, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders certainly campaign on that. And in the polling, I mean, just on a question of like, what should we do about tech? I mean, 70% of Americans think that a structural separation in the case of Facebook is a good idea, and that includes 50% of Republicans. Same thing on the wealth tax. If you look at the public polling, it's dipped a little bit. I mean, Jim, some of your coverage on this in the Times has, I think, been surprising to a lot of people. So in my view, there is a broad consensus that the concentration of power has become too pronounced. And there's a robust debate about what to do about it. I think I don't want to be Pollyannish and just, but it does feel to me that there is that consensus exists. And I think that's what's driving a lot of the conversation in the country right now around what can markets do, what can't they do? Should we rely on markets for our biggest approach to climate change? Should we approach it with an industrial policy, which is still a kind of market-based approach, but with a government backing? I think that's the terrain of the debate right now, at least as I see it. But maybe others disagree.
Can
I'm
I say
curious.
something on the polling? So on the polls of UBI, like 43% of Americans support the idea of not your negative income tax, but universal basic income. People want to check, okay? And so when Magda and I put out our op-ed arguing against UBI, I got a lot of hate mail from UBI supporters, and they generally had the following flavor, like, hey, bad word, lady, $1,000 a month would really help those of us who don't want to be in the rat race. We could live the life we want to live, and Amazon should pay for it with a VAT. And I'm thinking, what social contract is that, right? So I like going back to Damon's point of like, what's our social welfare function? And like having rich corporations give me money so I could live the life I want doesn't feel to me like a very compelling social contract.
I don't think that's fair, though.
A much more compelling social contract in my mind is to help people who, through no fault of their own, like find themselves in economic disadvantage. And so let me come back. Like I realize I have two hobby horses, skills and kids. But let me talk about kids and why I think we don't spend nearly enough protecting kids. If we took, so right now we have 12.8 million kids in the US who live in poverty, okay? 18% of kids live in poverty, more than any other demographic group in the US. Social Security was terrific for fighting elderly poverty, but we don't have any sort of Social Security guarantee for kids. If you took the average Social Security benefit, which is $16,000 a year, and gave it to every kid living in poverty, child poverty would be less than 1%. That is a value judgment that we're just not prioritizing fighting child poverty. Now that would cost close to $200 billion a year, so that would be a lot. So let's give them half of the Social Security benefit. If we gave every kid in poverty today $8,000, half the Social Security poverty, child poverty would be less than 5%. So when we just want to talk about inclusive growth and what our spending priorities are, for me, investing in kids and giving more targeted support to people who are in economically disadvantaged situations, that's just always going to be at the top of my list.
Damon?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up another argument. And I think that there's still evidence that needs to be brought to bear here. But I think one counterpoint to like Melissa's proposal is that these targeted programs are not as politically sustainable as universal programs. So in the comparison she made with Social Security, which is broad-based for people above a certain age, the brand of Social Security is that it's like bulletproof in some sense in terms of dependable. You can rely on it. It's going to be coming in some form. Everybody thinks it's going to disappear like in 10 years, but it's definitely not going to do that. And it has survived over many decades. And so to think that that can just be converted and targeted to kids, to poor kids, empirically is not necessarily clear. Like we have this current policy change with SNAP that has just taken place this week or yesterday as an example of the types of things that are targeted that you can get more bang for your buck because you don't have to spend as much money, but that we have a lot of heterogeneity across states and how well they're protected. Same with Medicaid. And so the question is, some of these programs, in order to get them to stick, do they have to have a more universal flavor, which could cost more? But I think that from a federal perspective, that one argument in favor of more bold universal design policies is that you can fill in some of the patches that arise across different states when you have types of policies that are more decentralized. There's heterogeneity in how well they're supported or how generous they are across states. And so I think that if the argument is that targeted policies are what we need, we do have to be honest about how well those things are protected and sustained.
Two brief comments, Jim. One is, Chris, whatever I would do in terms of economic policy, I wouldn't do it by polling. There was a poll the other day of Republicans, I don't remember who did the poll, 52% of those polled thought that Trump is a better president than Abraham Lincoln. I think that's a somewhat debatable topic. And I remember President Clinton, I went to President Clinton in 1998, he said, Mr. President, we now are going to have a budget surplus for the first time in 30 years. We can address our deficits in public investment. He said, the Republicans are going to say they want tax cuts, and that is where popular appeal will lie. How do we counter that? Erskine was there because Erskine was the one who responsible for getting that legislation through Congress, much to his credit. And the answer was we had to think of a way to do it, but you couldn't. I don't think public understanding of economic issues as reflected in polling is the way that I at least think we should make policy. Damon, I agree with you on the collective bargaining. I think one of the great shortfalls of our current economic system is the weakness of collective bargaining, and I think that should be an imperative of a conclusive growth policy agenda.
I would love to just get you all talking just a little bit about the question of whether fiscal constraints. Should we think about there being fiscal constraints? Should we be thinking about raising lots of revenues? Should we be thinking about just trying to stay within, or even I'm going to suggest that you might think bringing down the current budget deficit? How do you all think about the sort of broad fiscal question? Start from down there and work our way back.
That's a good question because it's like over the past couple of years, I've been going through an identity crisis with fiscal constraints because I'm a public economist, and you wake up in the morning and you just think about balancing a budget or lowering deficits, and then you go to sleep thinking about that. But what I will say is that I think that there is some responsibility for those who are pushing for fiscal constraints to make it very clear and also make the empirical case about what is too much of a deficit or what is too much of a debt. So if you just take it as a given that we should be bringing the debt down or in general, and that is the default, I think that we need to push people more to say how much debt is too much and why do you think that is the case. The common kind of economic argument that is made for this is that if we have too much debt, it's going to crowd out investment, and it could lead to higher interest rates. And empirically, right now, it's not clear that we're strapped for investment or that we're facing very high interest rates. And we've had debt grow and also haven't seen these things necessarily respond. Now, that's not good empirical analysis because a lot of things change at the same time. But it still is the case that there should be an empirical, a request for more empiricism behind the claims or the goals and the kind of like guidelines and principles that are presented in terms of fiscal restraint. After the Great Recession, we pivoted to fiscal policy. And some would argue that maybe we did that too quickly and that we could have had a more robust recovery if we did not do that. But in general, I do think that I understand the reasoning behind wanting to take the debt down or to bring deficits under some limit. But the reasoning that is provided for that, I think, should also be grounded in some way to empirically say that this is actually what's going on, that this is going to crowd out investment for the U.S. at this time, and that's not empirically clear. Chris?
I'm still stuck on the. I'll talk about the debt thing in a second, but on Bob's comment around polling, I think this really is the fundamental ideological difference between my outlook and yours, but to the extent that we're proxies for different communities. What is economics for? In my view, it is to serve the people.
I agree.
To create security and freedom for them. And as a result, it is constantly a political debate. It should be thought of as a social science and not something from the hard or physical sciences. And the more that we look to we need textbooks and we need conversations with people in real lived experience about how the economy works for them. So if people are saying that the economy as it's currently designed is creating immense inequality and it is unjust, then it is the people's right and prerogative to say enough and to say a wealth tax or higher marginal rates or whatever it may be should do that. So to the extent that those who design policy are not listening to the popular will, which includes some polling, I think that it does a disservice to the field of economics and to the practice of public policy, because the public, the key phrase in public policy is what counts. On the question of the how to pay for it, I think we need both new revenue and debt financing. I largely agree with everything Damon said. 10 years ago, the idea that a debt to GDP ratio that we have today around 100%, I mean, that would have been frighteningly high. And yet, you look at the graph, I think it's in the book, in one of the papers, the rates on the treasuries since 1980 go in one direction. I mean, I think it's 2.2%, something on the 30-year treasury today. So that's not to say that the levels of debt don't matter. Of course they do. And there are theoretical bounds. But I think at this moment, we would do well to focus on the public policy that would help working Americans and monitor the debt and monitor revenue levels as we go, but not allow that to be an excuse to not to think big.
Okay, so now you've asked about the debt, and Chris raised like the existential question of what economics is. So let me start with that. As an economist, this is what I tell my students at like the first lecture of every semester, public finance, where I say, our role as economists is to bring the positive evidence to bear and let the political process make the normative judgments. And what I mean by that is, one, like we live in the reality of the data and the evidence, and we know that there are trade-offs and there are costs to decisions. And so we do the best we can to present objectively what those trade-offs are, what the likely response is to various government policies, and then the political process can make those decisions. But a lot of what the public seems to want doesn't fit within the reality of economic trade-offs. So yes, the public might want Medicare for all that pays for everything and has the best healthcare quality to offer, and they just want a few really rich people to pay for it, okay? And so I think our job as economists to say, that's not available. Here are the trade-offs, and let's make those trade-offs. And I think this gets back to the debt issue and fiscal financing. I mean, I think we need to raise more revenue because I think we need to be spending more, investing in people, making sure that our population is ready for the modern economy, whatever global forces are going to come and challenge our economic system and our workers. Okay, so I think we need to be raising more money because I think we do need to be paying for our programs. I generally subscribe to what I think is sort of just the conventional wisdom on this. I don't think money falls from the sky. I don't think we could just spend and produce money to get ourselves out of the issue that we have to pay for things. I will give a nod to Bill Gale's excellent memo or chapter in the book, which talks about sort of how we could put our country back on a sustainable fiscal path. In this sense, and this gets to the question of debt and Chris's point, I think the 2017 Tax Act was really a missed opportunity. we were responding to populist sentiment across the board from Democrats, Republicans alike. I mean, I guess in my naivete, I thought the government response would say, okay, yes, to your point, there's a populist backlash and we need to be making our system more progressive and investing more and helping the people who are feeling left behind more. And instead, what the 2017 Tax Act did was make the tax code less progressive and essentially gave up $1.9 trillion over the next 10 years. That's $1.9 trillion that could have done a lot of good. We had an excellent proposal last year from the Economic Strategy Group for a $20 billion annual investment in community college. That would have made a really meaningful difference in college completion rates for low-income students. $20 billion a year. I mean, that's like, not a big amount compared to the money that was sort of given up by these tax cuts. I told you it only cost $200 billion to essentially eliminate child poverty. And so, in the spirit of paying for things and in the spirit of doing more for people who are feeling left behind, I think there are things we could be doing within the current framework.
Yeah, Chris, I think we're in violent agreement that the American people feel, and they're right to feel this, that there's an inequality that doesn't make sense economically and doesn't make sense socially. I think where you and I disagree is how do you respond to it? And I at least think you've got to be hard-nosed and thoughtful, and there needs to be a serious purpose around policy that does what Melissa said, which is take into account all the effects probabilistically evaluated, and then you do costs and benefits, and you decide what the trade-offs are and where you go. And that's a very hard-nosed, disciplined process. Damon, I don't think there is a number that you can set on. I think your points are well taken. But I don't think there is a number you can set on what should our debt to GDP ratio is. Right now, it's not what Chris said. It's not 100%. It's actually 78% if you take the publicly held debt, the federal debt that's publicly held. And it's projected to be about 102, 103% by CBO 10 years from now. It's already, I think at least, reducing our resilience in our fiscal space if we have a next crisis. And I think it's creating a real political and financial constraint on the public investment we desperately need. The other effects aren't happening yet. But I at least think, and I could be wrong, but I think they almost inevitably will happen at some point. And when they do, interest rate and business confidence and the rest will have a tremendous effect. And we don't need to take that risk because there is another path that we could take, which is the path that Melissa briefly referred to, which is, and I guess I did too as well, take advantage of the fact that we have a 16% of GDP revenue situation right now, and we could I think we can go very close to 20% as long as we did it sensibly and thoughtfully and pay for a lot of new stuff and start to reduce our debt to GDP ratio. And our healthcare costs are about 17% of GDP, and the other developed countries are around 10%. There clearly is a lot to be saved with sensible healthcare policy that addresses costs.
Melissa, do we have time for one or two of these audience questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We'll do this sort of lightning round style, if that's okay. And so just keep your answers quick, possibly. Oh, we've got more out here. We are not going to get to all these, friends. I am sorry.
I think this goes to 11:15.
Okay, yeah, no.
Yeah, we have some time.
Have you noticed the lengths of the answers so far?
No, these are going to be short.
No, okay.
You want 30-second answers?
Yes, all right, yes. So quickly, to the skills argument, the share of population over 25 with a college degree has consistently gone up. We've never been more educated as a society, but wages have still stagnated. So is a focus on skills still the best solution for inclusive growth? Melissa, you want to start with that?
Yeah. So both of those facts are true, but what's really true is that there is the college-educated workers, their wages are still substantially higher than workers without a college degree. Their employment rates are also substantially higher. So raising the number of people with a college degree, sort of the first direct effect it will do is increase the wages for those individuals. We are certainly not in like a calibration moment where there's no longer a return to college degree because we have so many college degree holders in the US. There's still a huge premium. There would be a huge boost to earnings for people. We know that like there's a causal effect of getting a college degree on earnings. I think right now there's been a 45% increase in the college enrollment over the past 15 years, which is excellent. More people than ever are going to college. Completion rates are still quite low, especially for kids from low-income backgrounds, especially for students at non-selective schools, which by the way is about half of the college students are at non-selective schools. So there's a lot of scope for improving institutional performance and improving student outcomes and increasing persistence and completion rates for the people who are already going to college.
Yeah, Anyone else want to take some of that?
All
All right, we'll just keep going. Views on H-1B visas and how skilled immigration factors into this discussion of wages. Anyone?
I think what's happening right now is that American businesses, I know this factually, American businesses are moving operations out of the United States because they can't get the skilled workers that we have traditionally been attracting the best and the brightest from around the world. I think we're making a terrible mistake.
If you ask any scholar of entrepreneurship or productivity, what's their top policy level, they almost all point to skilled immigration.
Okay, we're just going to keep this going fast and furious. And maybe this one for the gents at the other end of the table here. Would it be much more efficient to change our tax system to a flat tax simply because it would be easier to design?
I think flat tax can be defined in a lot of different ways, but no, I think that just the optimal design of tax is probably going to involve progressivity, and there are a lot of loopholes that we could close in the tax system that would allow us to maintain that progressivity. So I don't think so.
All right, so then to riff off that, actually, I'm going to modify one of these questions just a little bit. What is the best actual way then to tax more income at the top, specifically billionaires is the question here. Is it through the income tax? Is it through the wealth tax? How would you optimally do that? Chris?
I think you do both. I think, the top line is I think you could raise and should raise ordinary rates across the board, close capital gains loophole. I think a wealth tax in the country, particularly as it's being talked about today, would be a really good idea. You're talking about a couple percent of a rate on net worth above $50 million. It's really meaningful. There are a lot of questions around, well, how did it work internationally? Where did it work? Where didn't it work? There's a lot of questions around implementation. Those are good ones. They're constitutional questions too. So those are important ones to answer. But that's the terrain that the debate is on, and I think should be on. Let's just not say that's the only answer here, because I think that there are many.
I think there's a very rigorous debate, but there's also I don't think we should just take as given our ability to tax wealth that could flee the country, and we can take that maybe as something that can be improved, our ability to make our tax system less leaky across international borders. And so we shouldn't just take it as a given that money can just be moved across borders.
There's a policy analyst in Washington who's very highly respected, I won't use his name, but I think had a good comment. He said the probability of getting a wealth tax, given the constitutional issue and the political issue, is probably very low. If we only got one bite at the apple, we got to place it where it's realistic. Stepped up basis of death. There are some people who think we should cap deductions at 28% or some such thing, make it 28% credit. There are other areas in the inheritance tax. Certainly we could raise rates on ordinary income inside how much, that's another question. The pass-throughs that were enacted in the 2017 legislation is an area of enormous, I at least think, should be and a whole bunch of these. Larry Summers and, I forgot Natasha's last name, Natasha.
Sarin?
Yeah, had a very good piece in I think it was the Boston Globe, with a list of these that would raise about 2.8 trillion over 10, if I remember correctly. It's worth looking at. I don't agree with all of them, but I think they're all worth thinking about.
Right, I agree.
I agree with that, and just on the point of the wealth tax being a couple percent, I find that very misleading to the debate. A 2% to 6% wealth tax annually is like a 60% wealth tax over a 10-year period, and if you convert that to the income tax, if you have an asset yielding 3% return and you tax it at 6% a year, that's a 200% income tax. So
Assuming no growth of the wealth.
I just think it's not useful to shroud this as it's only a couple percent. Let's be very clear that it's 60% over a 10-year period.
That's not. I think the way that
You
most
could
wealthy
shrug it
people,
off,
as a member of the 1%, I can speak for a few of us at least.
0.001%.
Add as many zeros as you'd like. I can say that you don't stay flat. I mean, over the long term, any kind of economic analysis is going to factor in some kind of growth. People might argue, is your wealth going to grow at 5%, at 8%, at 2%, et cetera? So it is a meaningful amount, a couple percent. And I do think it's still just a matter of decreasing the long-term growth of those fortunes. It's not cannibalizing it in any kind of meaningful way, at least in my opinion.
Okay, quick change of pace. Bob, this is a specific question for you. Could you add more detail on your idea for the need for strong government? Are there specific changes that need to make to strengthen democracies and democratic institutions?
Let's leave Jim there. I personally think there's a lot you can do institutionally that's important, but I think the fundamental thing that's been lost is what Erskine did so extraordinarily well in 1997. Erskine said to me, and he said to others, we're going to get a balanced budget agreement because we're going to reach a compromise with the Republicans. And I said, Erskine, you're out of your mind. It's not going to work. And Erskine said, you're wrong. And I said, no, I'm not wrong. You're wrong. But it turned out he was right because he did it. But I think, Jim, somehow or other, we've got to stop denigrating the willingness to engage in principled compromise and stop treating it as weakness and recognize that in our democratic political system, that is the only way, for the most part, I mean, every once in a while you can do something, but for the most part, it's the only way we're really going to move forward. But how you accomplish that change, I have a whole bunch of thoughts on that. We don't have time for right now, but that I think is the essential thing you have to change.
And then for the rest of the group, this is a different question, but it's related. Can we really have strong government in the context of extreme economic inequality? Do you actually need a reduction in inequality to come before you can have that strength?
You can't get Ron Klain says that's a vicious cycle. To get the reduction in inequality, you need good policy. And to get good policy, you have to have effective government. They got to work together.
Totally agree.
Yeah. All right, a couple more because you guys are actually answering very quickly and I appreciate it. U.S. states have a large role in regulating their economies, but they also have very wide disparities in inequality levels. Is there anything we can learn from states about effectiveness in combating inequality?
That's a really good question. I don't have a very good answer to that specific question, but it does raise an important point that hasn't come up, which is actually inequality now is very wide across places and across states in ways that in the past there would be economic convergence. Places that were suffering economically there would be convergence in income and employment across places because people and capital would move. And that process doesn't seem to be working quite as well anymore. So now we have persistently wealthy regions and persistently poor regions in a way that exacerbates the inequality in our country, and I think leads to some of the democratic issues that we're seeing with just, coasts in the center thinking very differently about what the country needs to be doing, and that reflects, I think, to a large extent, different economic realities.
I have a much more troubling response. I think Melissa's right, but I have a much more troubling response, Jim. If you look at the states like New York and California that have done most to try to help deal with these problems, they now have very difficult fiscal conditions and high tax rates that are driving business and activity out. And I think that's a very serious problem.
Jens, any thoughts?
I think the states face different set of constraints than we do at the federal level. So there may be some lessons to observe, but things like how easily a company can move out of a state, or the balanced budget amendments that they face are just different than what is faced at the federal level. So there's some limit to how much we can learn about national policy from the variation across the states.
And then the last question, which just is an extension from that, is about cities, which, the rise of the superstar city is a big driver of inequality right now. Is there something that a local leader should be doing to work on these issues, or is this just a federal issue that then has effects down to local level?
I think that cities are in many ways a hotbed of innovation on a lot of these things. They're naturally constrained because they have less money and less of tax base in many places. But whether it's on tax rates, whether it's on universal pre-K, whether it's on a pilot for a guaranteed income that the mayor of Stockton, California, Mayor Michael Tubbs, is doing, I think that there's a lot of experimentation in cities, and it's a good thing. It's as long as we don't just use that logic to say, well, cities are just going to take care of it, because financially, fiscally, the math just won't ever add up.
Could I ask Chris a question?
One wanted to make a comment, and then you can.
I think an interesting thing about cities is that they may represent the front line of what we are socially willing to commit to. And so in cities, the issues with extreme wealth and income inequality can be very pronounced. And there are cities where we're seeing like a path that they are deciding to choose between with no middle and massive inequality, or some sort of like social agreement that we should invest in the broad swath of the residents of the city. And so commitments to things like public education and commitments to combating segregation, or being willing to build more housing, how we treat homeless people. I think that things that have to do with social cohesion, if they're to work at a national scale, what we see happening in cities could be very telling about what options or what the potential may be. And so, in some sense, there's some troubling trends that you're seeing in some very local settings in terms of how willing people are to commit to some sort of social contract.
All right, I think we actually have to stop it there, but thank you all so much. Thanks to the panel. This was great.
On a
Thank
good
you,
note.
Jim.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, the final program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The panel will begin shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, please find your seats. The program is about to begin.
Okay, we're ready to go? Okay, we're ready to get started. And this is something I'm very much looking forward to a conversation with my good friend Ray Dalio. I think most of you probably know Ray, but he was the founder of Bridgewater. He's now co-chief investment officer, co-chairman. If you don't know what Bridgewater is, it's the largest and I think one of maybe the most successful hedge funds in the world. So he's a great investor. What has always intrigued me about Ray is I might call him an economic engineer. He's taken a scientific approach to looking at the global economy, economic cycles, and he's developed a model of how the economy works. And then that underpins his model for markets and his model for investing. And he's also a terrific author. He's got a book out there that's a real blockbuster. It's sold over 2 million copies, and it's principles. And these are his principles for life and work. And it did so well. He's got a condensed version now that's come out, Principles for Success. The one that I read very carefully was one he wrote last year, which was the principles for understanding big debt cycles, which was about how these were the principles that let him anticipate the 2008 financial crisis and navigate it. It's something I could have used when I was in Washington. But anyway, so Ray, this is a conversation about capitalism and reforming capitalism. You were, I think, in the vanguard calling for a reform of capitalism. We had an interesting discussion in one of the earlier panels where Bob Rubin defined capitalism as market-based economies. Some people talk about it as property rights or private property ownership. I listen to the political debates. A lot of it they define it as anything they don't like about capitalism. So the question is, how should we define capitalism? How do you look at it?
It's private ownership of profit-making entities. The means of production, but the means of production is on a profit-based system.
Okay, so I'm going to get to something else that Bob Rubin talked about in the last panel. So you said capitalism has either got to evolve or die, right? And we look at capitalism. This has been the prevailing successful form of economic development for some time. So given how predominant it has been and how successful it's been, why is it you see this need to reform it?
Everything has to evolve or die, right?
Right.
I mean, it's just the law of nature. So I'm not saying abandon it or anything.
Yeah.
I'm saying you need to reform it. You need to look at the output and say, is the output consistent with what your goals are? And then if the output is not consistent with what your goals are, you have to re-engineer it in a way that it achieves your goals. And the goals should be to both increase the size of the pie and divide it. So I think the basics of a great economy, and this has, by the way, been true throughout time. You can go back thousands of years, and you look at the rises and dynasties, or you look at the different empires and reserve currencies and so on, that there has to be what are the elements that create productivity, and then if you don't have enough inclusiveness, you will not tap all the labor markets that you can to do well, and you'll have a system that's not deemed fair, and so then you have revolutions. You have peaceful revolutions or violent revolutions, depending on that, but you have some form of revolution. And so if we're looking at what will be good in the future, we have to think about how do we reform it to get the outcomes we want.
So you obviously look at this the way I do, and so on. There's a real tie between political stability and income disparity or inequality.
Well, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
I think the period that we're in many ways,
Yeah.
is very much like the late 1930s.
Right.
Let's say 1929 to 1932, we have a debt crisis and then interest rates hit zero.
Yeah.
Same as 2008-9. When interest rates hit zero, then central banks print money and buy assets.
Right.
That causes financial asset prices to go up.
Right.
We then have a rise in a wealth disparity, not just because of that, but also because of technology or other factors. We can look at mechanically why does that occur. And then you have a large wealth and opportunity gap coupled with a values gap. So so that's internally. Then externally, we have the rise of a challenging power to challenge an existing world power.
Yeah.
And so the big things that happen, and you don't have a monetary policy which will be effective in the next downturn because of the nature. So we have three big things that now exist that didn't exist except if for the last time they existed was the 30s, and those three things are the size of the wealth and the political gap, the absence of the effectiveness of monetary policy and where we
the
are,
rivalry with China, right?
and then the emergence of.
So you looked at 1935. Can you think of any other time in history? You're a historian. Any other time?
Well,
outside?
this happened if you take 1944, we changed the world order.
Right.
We began the United States won the war,
Yep.
and we had a new monetary system, and here we go. Then you go the British Empire, okay? Same things happened when the British Empire emerged, and the Dutch, which used to have the reserve currency,
Right.
operated that way. You can go back in all dynasties in China, or you can go back in all empires, and the same basic things happen. You have an internal conflict that leads to a regime change. You often have an external conflict. You have an overextended level of indebtedness by the reserve currency because everybody is holding that reserve currency. So you have internal conflict, external conflict, and you have, so it's happened. I went through the dynasties in China.
I know it. It's fascinating. I was just see what I told you. I read a paper he's written on China, one of the most interesting things, and you've looked back over the dynasties.
Well, when I found out, why do I do this? I found that the biggest surprises that ever happened to me were things that didn't happen in my lifetime, but happened many times before my lifetime. So on the 2008 financial crisis, for example, I wouldn't have understood that or anticipated that if I didn't understand the other ones. So these things happen, but they don't happen in our lifetimes often because the arc is greater, right? So when we're talking about these things, yeah.
So let me now personalize it a bit more. Okay, so you run a big, successful asset management firm that's a hedge fund. So big, successful hedge fund. And a lot of people that are coming after capitalism and criticizing capitalism, they point to financial services, they point to hedge funds, a source of inequality, the root of all evil, unfairness, etc. So how do you, I know you square these things, but how do you square it?
Well, whether it's any financial institution, I think it's everybody's so critical of each other and so prejudiced about what people are thinking that it's very fragmented. I think fragmentation in decision making is our biggest problem. I watched the last panel and I thought to myself, what a group of intelligent people. But we're in a society now, I think, where everybody's saying, I think this, and the coordination of people to try to figure out, to try to work out together, how does a machine work? So this demonization of one group or another, where there's such a prejudice, let's say, again, it could be the billionaire, but that's just like the Jew or the XYZ. And if you continue to operate in that highly fragmented way, and you don't operate in a more cohesive way, I would say, like in history, one principle is when the cause becomes more important than the system is in jeopardy. And I think we're getting to the point where the causes are more important than the system, and how the system of working together to resolve disagreements and make it inclusive, that's in jeopardy.
Yeah, and I call it the politics of grievance. You don't, if you want to blame your situation on someone else, you don't spend time really thinking through the solutions the way you should. And yeah, but you're right, and everybody seems to have their own facts. And that's one of the things we've really emphasized with this Aspen Economic Strategy Group, is working with a common set of facts.
But let me challenge you on that.
Yeah, okay. Go.
May I?
Yeah, sure. Go, absolutely. You can challenge me on anything.
Okay. Those wonderfully intelligent people that we saw on that.
Yeah.
The notion of, and this group, to reach a decision, a policy to resolve that. I mean, you almost have to lock the people up in a room for 6 months or 3 months. And then the question is, what for?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got to take that, and what matters is who has their hands on the levers of power, and what are they going to do? So in order to have impact, I think one has to engineer who has their hands on the level of power, because even if you came up with the most wonderful progress, we can't be naive about what makes people make decisions.
You sure can't. And it's one thing to know what you'd like to do. It's another thing in getting it done. And one of the things I learned in government when I was there was no low-hanging fruit, right? Things that looked like simple, like Social Security reform, were politically complex, and then others, and then healthcare reform was economically complex and politically complex. But there's nothing, so you got to get it done. And one of the things you had talked about, which I think was interesting, getting to it, which would be changing our whole political system. You said that we should declare maybe I'm paraphrasing, a national emergency and put together a commission to deal with income inequality. And of course, if I wanted to challenge you on that, I'd say, well, you could have all kinds of commissions, but ultimately Congress is our commission, right? I mean, that's where something's got to get done. And so there's no perfect solution. So talk a little bit about what you think. How do you, in our system, get the kind of change we need? It's a little bit like a catch-22, right? The income disparity, it leads to a broken political system, and it's hard to fix the economic problem when you've got a broken political system, and it's hard to fix the economic problem when you've got, it works both ways.
I could answer that question at two levels. The level of what do I think should be done? And I think that's a waste of time.
Right.
But we can go back into that.
Right.
Or I can answer it at what I was trying to do at the higher level, is to say, and I don't think we'll do this, I think that the one thing that those who are in positions of power, and maybe it's the president, maybe it's Congress, or maybe it's a governor in a state, should do, is to say, this is a national emergency. It's the thing that will threaten us. It's like a cancer. It can take us down. It can be terrible, and it's unfair. And if you can say that, okay, and then you bring in parties that live in the various communities and have on the ground, not just arrogant, just not us, but I learned from people who are involved in different things, and you bring those people in, and from the left and from the right, and you lock them up in a room or something, and you come to something that represents the smart approach. Now, I think Bob touched on it, and we talk about principles. Okay, what I mean by principles is, if we could agree on how the machine works, so if you move this lever and that, and it's not that complicated, I think we could, and then you say, how do I deal with it so that I can increase the size of the pie, divide it well. And I want to emphasize, it's not equal wealth, okay? It's not equal income, okay? It is, most importantly, equal opportunity, recognizing that productivity is, we're not going to raise our living standards if we don't increase the size of the pie. So we have to increase it well and divide it well so that people believe it's a fair system and so on. Now I could go down to the level below that. I'll touch on the level below that. I think the issue is return on investment. Okay, to start at a minimum with the notion of looking at things that are good return on investments. There's the question of a budget. There's a lot of debate on the budget issue. Do you constrain a budget? And I'm going to answer with my thought, but if you make good investments, let's say like a good investment in education, right? There's almost nothing better than to have a good investment in education. And you're constraining that by a budget, that's stupid. Because, and anything that's a good investment, the question is it a good investment? Because think about a company that it could not have either debt or raise capital. How far would any of these companies grow? And so when you're dealing with a system that is all the various things, we have to look at whether it's a good return on investment. Now the problem is when you have government policymakers making that choice, that's a challenge. But as it could be a philanthropist or a business or so on. What we're doing something with the state of Connecticut. We're trying to get kids through who would have dropped out of high school into
Remind
complete
you, when
high
you
school.
finish this, I want to come back and I want to ask you why you didn't go directly to the high schools, why you went to the state. But I want to,
Okay.
But finish this, then I want to get to that.
But I see so many things that are good return on investment that are starved for capital.
Right.
Philanthropic things and things.
Yeah.
Because they're not doing the all-in accounting.
Yeah.
So when we come to the issue of should the budget deficit, what do you do with debt?
Yeah.
Okay? The key thing is if it's a good return on investment, it'll pay back. There's a certain amount of, so anyway, I don't mean to.
Right.
So when we deal with, we should come to the notion of what is modern monetary policy, and that at some point in time, because I think that'll be.
I'd like to do that, Brett, because, and then let's do that. Then I want to go to Connecticut. Then I've got another question in mind, because you heard the this group and the group before talking about the fiscal deficit, and you've stated that that's not your number one concern, obviously, and you make a very good case. Anybody that's run a business knows that the key thing is you spend when if it's a good investment, the money comes back. Now, that's not the way government works. That's not the way policymakers work. There's a lot of investments they make that aren't great investments, and so on. But talk a little bit about modern monetary theory and your view of the deficit.
I think that there are three stages in monetary theory. By the way, this has happened repeatedly through time. Right. There's a reserve currency, and why do we end reserve currencies, and how does it work? And I won't get into all that. But the three stages are, first, that you have monetary policy. One is that you can move interest rates around. When you hit a zero interest rate, then that's not effective. Monetary policy 2 then means you change the quantity. You print money and you buy financial assets.
Right.
Okay. When that's not effective, you go to monetary policy 3. We're now in a situation mechanistically, I'm just speaking mechanistically, that monetary policy 2 of the purchases purchased $15 trillion of financial assets. And then mechanistically, the seller, investors, usually large institutional investors, take the money and what do they do with it? They invest in it. And so the world is awash with money. If you want to say who's got money, any investor is so awash with money, they say, how do I invest it? And you got negative something like $17 billion in negative interest rate because the world is awash for that. but it doesn't come trickle down for mechanistic reasons I can get into, okay? So we got that wash, and we have simultaneously a Fed study, 40% of all Americans could not raise $400 in the event of an emergency.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're at a pushing on a string. You do more quantitative easing, you hit that, the wheels are gonna spin, it won't create the solution. So we're dealing with monetary policy 3, okay? Monetary policy 3, or due to pushing on a string as we used to call it, monetary policy 3 means that there's some form of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy.
Yeah.
And that problem is that then that starts to politicize it and so on. But there's no doubt we're going to go to larger deficits, okay, much larger deficits. There's no doubt in the next downturn that there's going to be much more debt monetization. This happens late in reserve currency cycles, right? The key will be whether that's productive and how to make it productive, I think. So that's kind of what I think about.
Yeah, well, that's, there's a lot to unpack in there, and I think that's a very, very useful discussion. And it may get me to I think you've more or less answered the next question I had in my mind, which is why calling for the reform on capitalism right now? Why not, 5 years ago or 3 years ago or whatever? And I think, as you see it, we're really pretty darn close to a tipping point, right?
Yeah. Well, there was a move that I wrote a study just after President Trump was elected, and was watching the move to populism. I did a study on populists. I wanted to see how to work by looking at all past cases of populism.
Right.
And then I did a study on looking at how the averages were misleading. Because, when we say the economy is this or unemployment that, I realized it's so misleading. So I broke down it by the quintiles, and I took the top 40% of the population compared to the bottom 60% of the population, and I saw what is shocking differences. For example, the top 40% for their children spend 5 times as much money as the bottom 60% on their incomes and so on. Yeah. So I noticed
that gets to Melissa's point on children too, which is why it's a crying need. But anyway, go on.
And then because of this studying of history, what was the 30s, what was the Great Depression, and so on, I think, and my wife works in these public school districts in Salem, and we see it. It was certainly apparent to me that we have this crisis, okay? Yeah. And nobody's talking about it. And it struck me like people were either capitalists or socialists, and there was no notion of, what is going on. And the American dream. What is the American dream?
Right.
We don't, if we could agree on what the American dream is, okay, I think the American dream, I was raised with the idea, something like equal
opportunity.
Right. If you have, look, all you need is parents, ideally, who will raise you well, love you and raise you well, a good public education, and you come out with equal opportunity. And if you have that, and you have a system that does that, then that'll work. But I could see that it's a self-reinforcing spiral of differences, so that what happens is the money doesn't go into the school district, because the Constitution means it's a state issue, and then within each state there's a tax district issue. And I live in Greenwich, Connecticut. I'm thrilled to send my kids to public school, but I'm next to Bridgeport, Connecticut, or Hartford in those areas, and there the kids, many kids can't even walk to school without having to go through areas where there are gangs and there's risks of shooting. And the police, literally, there are not enough police to assure safe passage because the budget isn't there, because the only tax that they can raise locally. So something is wrong.
Yeah. So for sure. So which gets me back to Connecticut. Just why did you trust the state of Connecticut in terms of, $100 million is a lot of money. And why didn't you give that directly to schools you chose? Why are you working with Connecticut there?
Yeah, to clarify what I did, my wife, Barbara, has for 10 years worked around the school districts to try to help out that population.
Right.
And she's gotten to know them well, and it made a lot of difference. And what we decided that we wanted to do was we would donate 100 million if the state would donate 100 million. So they had to kick in 100 million.
I forgot that. I got
Okay.
that.
So they kick in 100 million, and the state kicks in. I kick in 100. We kick in 100 million, and we're going to get other people to do it. And we're going to have a program in which we have this kind of diversity.
Private, public, right.
Yeah, that's right. And we're bringing in the board that's doing this decision making together is a highly diversified, but we all know they're good people on that. And we're doing it together, and we're going to do it to try to do the accounting so that we can show that it's very cheap to get kids through the high school and into a job. That'll be our mission, relative to the cost of not doing that. Because if you look at incarceration costs and other things along those lines, so we're trying to make that, and we want to do it together. Connecticut's our home. It's big for us to handle Connecticut. We can't handle the states, and so that's the plan. And it's had a good effect, because it's also had an effect to a large extent that we're in it together. Like, you don't know what it's like to be in some of their circumstances and to have budget cuts and to watch people in Greenwich, Connecticut drive around in their fancy cars and saying that we should cut other benefits and so on. So to be able to do this together in that way is what we're aspiring for.
That, to me, is just a terrific example. And I know of no one, not just because of this, I don't know of anyone who's more philanthropic than Ray and thinks more carefully and scientifically about how he gives away his money. So I, want to get to a couple of other questions here, and there was just, we had a panel. The first panel this morning was on concentration, big business. Is big business bad? Is antitrust enforcement good enough, et cetera? And I know this is a very complicated area, and you think a lot about these issues, but just briefly, what do you think about big business? How should we think about that?
It's like you said, most issues are complicated issues, and so to try to give the quick thing, I would say, just as you said down there, to come with it an oversimplistic thing. There are elements of competition that are not good for the big businesses, meaning the restraint of competition, elements of that. What that would mean is sometimes some businesses acquire other businesses without giving them almost of a choice. They will say, I'm going to acquire that business, which would have been an independent business, and then would have been more of a competitor, and so on. That exists to some extent, so without diminishing its importance, I would say it's not the big thing, okay? The big things are on the world stage also. How are we going to be competitive? There are many things to weigh against that, and that will represent only a small percentage of the overall question of how do we deal with the system. So you can change that by a little bit. My worry would be that you'd screw up the good parts to try to make the bad parts, to eliminate the bad parts. So you have to do that well. But in the scope of things, it's one tiny portion of an overall thing.
Well, let's get to the global stage, because you talked about the rise of China, and having companies that are competitive on the global stage. So tell me, comment about China's state capitalism, and that is the model, and how we stack up against that.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're calling it state capitalism understands that the essential difference between the United States and China, as a mutual friend in China told me, was, and it's shown through Confucian through time, is that they run the country, let me phrase it this way. He said, what matters most to you in the United States is the individual and individualism. And it's therefore everything's bottom up and everybody's got an opinion and so on. What matters most for them is the family, and they model it after the family, Confucianism, and it's like a parent.
Yeah.
And it's run a little bit more like a big company would be run. So it's top down, not bottom up. And then now, a lot of Americans make the mistake of thinking that communism is the old kind of communism, not the capitalism that I would call capitalism, the free ownership. You can make yourself a billionaire, everybody's excited about the dream, and you could do that, but you can't be politically active. So, and you can't just go out and be disruptive to the politics. You have to be, quote, a good citizen. So what's happening now is that they went to a very market-oriented cap. So when you go look at the energy, something like 1 out of 8 college graduates goes into a startup. And you look at the energy of what's happening down in Shenzhen and these great ideas and so on. This is happening in China at the same time as then there's the the top-down, more autocratic way of operating. So, and they have the capacity. Look at the inventiveness. Since I started going in 1984, incomes have increased by 26 times. They went from 2% of the world economy, 22%. The poverty rate has gone from 88% to less than 1%. Life expectancy's increased by 10 years. And they're I think that there's a good chance that, depending on how far left we go, that China will be more capitalist than the United States.
So I read a paper you wrote. I spend a lot of time in China. I've made many, many trips there. And I read a paper that you wrote that combined a lot that I understood about China, what I saw in China, with the history, with Confucianism, with the culture, which I thought combined the two and explained it through a different lens than I'd looked at it. I thought it was very, very good. Is that something that's been published publicly? Is that something that's generally available, or is that?
No, but I will put it on a link in LinkedIn. I go put the stuff on LinkedIn. I'm polishing it up, and I will put it there.
So that will be that. And I think when you do, it's an interesting. It's a very interesting frame. I want to move to financial markets in China when we're talking about China. Because this relates also to capitalism, and there's pressure right now to decouple. So we see a lot of pressure in this city to decouple, and talking about decoupling, financial markets from China. Give me your views on that, and what do you see? Where do you think this pressure is coming from? And I know you and I sort of agree on this. Why does this make no sense to be? Why is this harmful to the United States to be talking about decoupling?
We're at the point where, periodically there's a change in the world order. You have a reserve, 1944, I give the example.
Yeah.
And there are these, and then you have a rising power challenging existing power, and then there's economics and so on. So that's the big thing going on. So there are 5 types of conflict, okay, or 5 possible wars. Trade war is by far the least important of those. But there's a trade war, there's a technology war, there's a geopolitical war. There can be a capital war. You're referring to the capital war. And then there's cyber issues of how there's spying or whatever forms of other cyber issues. We can't go through all of those things. But in terms of the capital war, if you watch history, particularly like in World War II, starting in 1931, when Japan started to expand in Asia, and you go to 1941 when they dropped the bomb,
Yeah.
you can see the history of the capital war. And that capital war can involve cutting off the other country from capital in different kinds of ways. So at the range of possibilities, as you have maybe the president think, okay, I won't take our government pension fund and allow you to invest that, is just the tip of what's possible. It's like the Huawei is just the tip of the spear in being able to cut off technologies that go to China. And so as both countries think of that, the possible war, basically you've got a prisoner's dilemma situation, right? You have, and so you have a situation where you don't know the other one's going to harm you or help you. Do you harm the other or do you cooperate with the other? So each is, as they're working with that, that's the dilemma. So on the capital war, the president can unilaterally say, we're not going to service the $1 trillion of debt, for example, that is owned by China and so on. So if you take this far, so the issue of coupling when you could get into a conflict, if it was bad, is a vulnerability, intertwined. Everybody worries, how can you, the other one, cut the other one off in that conflict? And then also, am I helping, quote, the competitor? This is very much like the Dutch and the English in terms of like shipbuilding, and anyway, it's so intertwined. So we've gone from a world in which globalization we felt was best for the world, and is best for the whole because it allows specialization, each to do whatever is their best, but it wasn't best for all the individuals. And since it wasn't best for that population of individuals who are now becoming more dealing with theirs, the idea of what's best for the whole and how you divide it up is very different from what's best for the part. And so the decoupling is an extension of that.
Yep. Very, very well said. So we've got just a couple of left, and one last question. So we talk about, it's pretty clear, people in one of the earlier panels said they don't see robots coming. They may not see robots coming, but automation is here big time. And every time I talk to any company, they're automating all the time, and automating is making it more efficient, driving productivity, but it's eliminating certain jobs. And where do you come out on, because a number of people have suggested universal basic income as a solution. Where are you on that one?
Well, because there's two questions
Right.
embedded in your question.
You're right.
So I'm going to start with the first, and
Okay.
then we'll go to universal basic income
Okay.
in a moment. That which is the uniqueness of a person is diminishing relative to the uniqueness of technologies in various ways. And so we will have various big shifts, and that population will get smaller and smaller, and that other population that's going to be replaced. And so it's a big part of the whole overall issue that we're dealing with. And that's why I'm saying just setting back, before we get to what the solution is,
Yeah.
the setting back and thinking, okay, that's going to come. It's like if tides rise, how do you deal with the tides?
Yeah.
As part of that whole thing is that's a top-down national emergency, and then how do you engineer that? So that's part of that overall thing. It's certainly going to come.
Yep.
Now, as far as universal basic income, I think it was, as it was articulated well before, the real question is that the best? Is that the best way to have the best effect, okay? And from working in different communities and so on, if you take money away from those things that may be targeted and you write a check, in many cases, that money may not be used for the best possible purpose for the development of those children or the development of other things. And so if I'm having to make a choice of would I rather have when I'm operating in school districts or other things, and we talk about children and childhood poverty, okay? And we look at, okay, how do you target, in many cases with parents who are not able to take good care of their children in those, and how do you deal with that, or do you just let that sit? I would rather target it. I won't get into all the ways of targeting it, but the cost of that and the efficiency of that. And I also worry that income, we're talking so much money, so much about how to get more money to people, and not enough about how to produce wealth. If you do not produce, you will not sustain it. Like the Russian Revolution or revolutions, you look about it and they say, oh, they got all the wealth, and then they go and they take the wealth and they think they've got something valuable. But that, anything, we know the duration of an asset, and that all dissipates. And so you need productivity. And so how do you create both the productivity and the fairness and the broadening base? And I don't know that just giving the income in that way is the most efficient way to do it.
So Ray, this has been absolutely terrific. You know, I know you all have enjoyed this as much as I have, and there's, you know, Ray's book. If you haven't, if he has books out there, and if you haven't read the book, you are really missing something, because this is a terrific thinker, and the principles he's laid out there, which are what he's used not only in life but in his business and investing, are really will resonate with you, I believe. So Ray, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It's always a delight. It's a pleasure. Thank you.